Hello, listeners, and welcome to PolitFlix episode 16. I'm going with a slightly different version of format on this in that I want to record little micro blogger equivalent segments rather than one gigantic big...
Ignore him, we'll get carried away and do the lot. But
And there I was going to introduce you. Okay, I'm James Murphy, this is Dave Bond. Dave, how are you?
Hi folks, yeah, we've had three go, we're on our third go at this now. And
Dave, you're not supposed to tell people that. You're supposed to lie through our teeth.
I know, but when it's shit, will you at least have the, where you can relax safe in the knowledge that yesterday's was good?
It was very good. Unfortunately, we can only hear your bit, but there you go.
We'll have a go. I've got time, so let's just see how we go.
Okay, so the upshot of it is King Arthur and the thematic threads of King Arthur. We do have some specific King Arthur movies we're going to look at in various stages. But I'm going to kick off with, I suppose, as we usually do with PolitFlix, which is the bigger picture, which is politically and socially the theme of monarchy, of heraldry, and some of the cinematic legacies of that, which aren't necessarily specifically to do with King Arthur, but just some of the imagery. So I'm going to pick at various ways in. One of them being, if we start with sort of current affairs, we have a royal wedding coming up, right? Yes. You may be aware of this.
I am aware of it.
Dave, royalist, Republican, what's your thing? What's your background? How do you feel about the whole thing?
I don't have anything approaching a strong opinion. Genuinely, I mean, everyone's supposed to have an opinion on monarchy. I really don't.
Right. It's fair to say they bring in...
really dull on that, but...
No. But I mean, the I wouldn't say excuse. I would say the rationale for having a British monarchy, and I agree with this, to be honest, is tourists love it. It is a symbol that brings people...
That's the argument you always get, though. The most visited country in Europe is France.
And
you don't lose all the trappings of monarchy just because you lose monarchy.
Okay.
So
and there's I suppose...
The tourism defence has never been a big thing, but at the same time, do we want presidential elections and all that?
Who would we get as president? Let's think about it this way. However much people may tear into certain royals...
Depends what it is. It depends what it is. Are we looking at a figurehead, or are we looking at a sort of American model where maybe they boss foreign affairs or whatever?
We'd get President Beckham, really, wouldn't we? Frankly, let's face it.
Depends what it is. Depends what it is. Depends if it's a figurehead or what. But
we get President Blair.
Yeah. I've tried over the years to get excited about the whole thing, and I don't really care.
Harry is quite a charismatic guy, though. So if I take aside from the bigger picture of what I think about the monarchy, they're very handsome.
After his dad, whoever that was.
Ooh, controversial. Well, do you know how you debunk that? She hadn't actually met James Hewitt when Harry was conceived. There's the first problem with that. Because that's the general... You know all those memes that go around?
But they hardly would... He would hardly say, could be mine, don't know.
Well, if he thought there was a fast buck to be made, I don't know. By his own admission, he was a bit of a sort of a cavalier, roguish bounder, but loved that. And he was a military man, and he'd kind of earned the right to be that way, I guess. But then... He does look like a Spencer, though. If you look at the Spencers, that's what Harry looks like. He just takes after his mum more. I think it is very funny, and he probably himself, with his own kind of, has his own way of surviving all of that. But I think in terms of what the Royals do, if we look at them on an individual case-by-case basis, Harry's Invictus Games is an incredible achievement, and it's a lovely thing. I think there's someone who has actually served with the forces in a way that's quite tangible. We're not talking, he didn't go out to Afghanistan and peel spuds, but even if he had done that, that would still be quite a worthy thing to do. We're talking about a guy who flew Apache helicopters, so he's got all the machismo and all the kind of the swagger and the charisma and the actual substance to back it up. Meghan is absolutely beautiful. I think as an actress, it's almost a shame that she's cutting off her career to do this, because I think some of the stuff, I've only seen a few bits from Suits, but I think she had a screen presence. And she had a style. And stardom is a very different thing to, I'm going to rate someone as an actress. There are, of course, people who are both actors and movie stars. But I think she had star quality. And I think as a couple, it'll be an interesting kid that they make. It'll be both a kind of a warrior and a movie star, maybe. Or it could just be perfectly average and happy and normal, but they have it. It's part of Britishness. Is it also part of, I suppose, culture? When we think about class, the British class system is something that people do think about in both a positive and a negative way. I suppose if you have a King Arthur, you are naturally gravitating to the idea that he is anointed to be king. But of course, king in the Arthurian sense means he's going to be a political leader rather than, we're not King Arthur isn't interesting because he's simply born a certain way into a certain family. But are you classist? I mean, do you like the class system, or do you hate it? I mean, do you believe in sort of middle class?
I am just absolutely. I really. You couldn't have hit on a subject I'm less driven by. I mean.
Yeah.
I think it's a myth. It's a British thing. It really isn't. There's class systems everywhere, and I think people outside this country assume class system means you can't cross from one thing to another or better yourself. Or it is not like the Indian caste system.
Yeah.
It isn't. There are just various trappings of the way people dress, behave, and speak that denote from what sort of social class they hail. Well, that's no different in the United States. That's no different in any country you go to. I really have almost no opinion on it. Frankly, I mean, all this nonsense about whether Charles should succeed the throne and all this bollocks, well, firstly, it was never a popularity or a morality contest anyway. And secondly, cutting a ribbon on a new fucking ship or something is not... It's ceremonial. Let's not get too excited here.
But King Arthur, obviously, in his day, did a little more than cut ribbons. Not that he existed, but the mythology of the fusion of sort of Roman, Saxon, etc. And I think, so that's the other thing that makes King Arthur, I suppose, timeless as an ideal, is this idea of bringing together disparate British groups. Now, it is fair to say that in the same way as you pointed out quite rightly about the class system, every country in the world has some sort of a conflict about, well, we've got differing groups of people and how do we bring them together? How do we define that in a patriotic but non-nationalistic way? Britain is facing that at the moment. America is facing that at the moment. Because obviously with America, you've got, the whole Trump business of trading off nationalism and patriotism, but going too far with that into sort of a mass propaganda to this extent, sort of hysteria, make America great again stuff, although it worked for him and it's worked for certain other people. With Britain, whatever way we look at it, the sheer folie de grandeur, and I deliberately use a sort of European-sounding phrase there, of your favourite word, I know you hate it, Brexit, at a time when it is so important that we are not isolated. We risk, I mean, yes, okay, there are all the economic arguments about we can still trade with the rest of the world and so on, but we have to redefine our national identity right now, our economic identity, everything, at a time when we didn't need to. We did not need that. And yet these are timeless echoes of the same things that go right back to the first Arthurian sort of, if we go back to that sort of idea of the Joseph Campbell monument, the idea of a hero, a leader, is somebody who can take a nation or a community in a time of crisis, find its disparate strands and sort of weave them together. But is there such a thing as a leader that can do that? Or is it just smoke and mirrors when we find a leader that we think does that? I mean, can you think of any leaders off the top of your head that you genuinely believe in history have managed to really part the waters, so to speak, and bring disparate groups together?
Not without very much external, not without external circumstance, because we always look immediately to wartime. But what's uniting the country there is war, and all leaders can do is gently nudge. So you can gently nudge to a more combative stance towards it, or a more sort of compliant stance in the face of hostility. That would certainly speak to the differences between, say, Chamberlain and Churchill. But I think popularity, it's reliant on a degree of popularity. Popularity never lasts, and in the modern era, popularity is a shorter and shorter cycle. I think it's going to be a while before we have a Prime Minister lasting like 10 years again, because I just think that the job is 24 hours a day now. But also the fact that opinions, the spread of sort of dissent is much faster now, just because the means of people to talk to each other and spread that opinion is much faster. I think the ability to unite to the nation is I'm not even convinced it still exists.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned Churchill, because obviously, did you see Darkest Hour?
Yeah, I've seen it a couple of times actually. Yeah,
it's an interesting film because contrary to what some people thought about it, I actually felt that in a very nice way it managed to be to have a foot in both revisionist historian camp that actually he's not perfect, but at the same time another foot in the camp that says, well, even though he wasn't perfect and he knew his own flaws, there is no question that we faced extinction. We couldn't do business with, we couldn't be nice to the Nazis. There wasn't a third way deal. And for that, what is it they're saying? Demolition man, send the maniac, get you maniac. We needed a bad lad on the side of good, if you like. We needed somebody who literally could think like, I suppose, the most ruthless and calculating of military commander, and who had that kind of almost adolescent belief in the heraldic nature of Britain, who could channel that, once again, going back to that Arthurian promise of sort of a great Britain that is going to take on the bad guys. And however, fantastical in retrospect some of that imagery may feel, it did work. And it's the last, I think one of the reasons we have maybe this faux nostalgia for World War II is that it is the last clear example in our history whereby there is, as close as is humanly possible, Dave, to a black and white good versus evil struggle within war. Everything subsequent to that appears to be tainted by, well, there are a dozen different political agendas that one has to navigate. And Churchill, I think, was able to unite the strands. Not necessarily in terms of just...
I think he was both helped and hindered by that 10 years or whatever it was where he went over to the Liberals.
Yeah, the wilderness period.
Hindered in that, I think Darkest Hours portrays this very well, that his party wouldn't have minded getting rid of him. But at the same time, it's almost like Theresa May with Brexit. It's like, leave them there to take the fucking hits then. He courts no popularity in his party because he has no popularity in his party.
Yeah. He's not a nice man either, by his own admission. He's somebody who
no, and there's various stories of them at Yalta and on the way to things like that. Literally, sort of just sat in planes and stuff, dividing up the world on paper. There was a certain sense of superiority he copied with him. He carried with him. There's no doubt. But I didn't expect to get onto this subject. Where did that come from?
Well, it's the Arthurian bent, I suppose. But as I say, I
know, but we normally talk bollocks for an hour first.
Well, we are talking bollocks, but it's good bollocks. So the other Arthurian template. So yeah, Churchill, as I say, and that's where Darkest Hour scores for me very highly, is the idea that they managed to acknowledge that he was not this perfect ideal of Englishness. He had some certain adolescent and other drawbacks. But the fact of the matter is, clinically, this is a man who was brave and calculating enough to do the impossible and what was needed. But then you fast forward, and we're looking for that again and again, and politicians desperately trying to replicate that template. And he's a man of his time who does a particular thing in his time at the right time. You can't go trying to copy the template, even if there are echoes. And I think the word Camelot got thrown around for the court of JFK at the White House. I know that's superficially that works because he was a youthful man, and we tend to think of King Arthur, even though we've got the canon obviously covers all the legends, the disparate legends go from sort of sword in the stone or birth, whatever, all the way through to his death. So it's, it depends what version of King Arthur you go with. But I think there was this allegiance between idealism and youth that you bring with Kennedy. And then maybe the fall of that Camelot, because obviously in retrospect it was something that, a little bit like the Churchill myth, had flaws to it. It doesn't mean that he wasn't a very promising, great, inspirational leader. It doesn't mean he didn't do a lot of good. But the idea that he was perfect, I think, is something that, and we've touched on this when we did the JFK podcast. But what's your feeling on Kennedy as a leader? Just
there's a big question to answer in a soundbite.
He was competent. The idea that he was a pup who needed to be sort of taken down a peg, because I think there are certain elements who, this is the problem with revisionists.
In reality, he didn't even do 3 years. He didn't even do 3 years. He had a glamorous wife. He had he was very, very youthful in the role relative to what they get. I mean, you can't become president until you're 35 anyway. Yeah. So his war history got spoken up. He won the Pulitzer Prize for Profiles in Courage, I think it was. Yeah. And obviously we came very close to the brink in Cuba, and a few things like that burnish what may or may not be a myth. I don't know, because in the broad scheme of things, like I say, 2 years and 10 months he was president. Don't know if that's long enough to really form really a legacy, to be honest with you.
Yeah, but I think certainly an event filled. It certainly wasn't dull or boring. And I think that's the other thing, is that people like things happening around politics. I know that sounds like an incredibly vague thing to say, but politicians, I think, regularly get damaged by...
This is a really... we're in the midst of quite a dull era at the moment, because the tone gets set by your Prime Minister. And we've got basically a dull civil servant-y type as Prime Minister at the moment.
Yeah. But then, of course, we don't want it too exciting. I mean, Blair was very exciting, but for all the wrong reasons in the end. I mean, I do remember the sense of energy and optimism that kind of swept the country.
You're never going to get that with a Theresa May, are you? Regardless of how she came to power.
I don't think we're ever going to get it again, because I think there's always going to be that replicated. And that's been the mistake. The reason the third way has fallen, in my opinion, and I could be wrong, and I welcome people saying, no, James, you're talking nonsense, but the problem with the third way, and I'm a great believer still in the third way, is that it is only as good or as bad as the figurehead who propels it into the public consciousness. Now, Blair managed to harness a certain energy which coincided with, and to some extent mirrored, I hesitate because I don't think that's particularly fair, but let's say for the purposes of brevity, let's say copy the aura that was coming off Clinton, who was driving an empire of new ideology. Let's put the left and the right out of business for good by proving that centrist politics is both the logical and rational and a necessary way forward. And subsequent to the fall of Blair and the lack of a charismatic enough replacement for Clinton, until Obama certainly, and he's not quite the same as Clinton in terms of his worldview. People have either tried to copy that, as in like beat for beat, and been called out on their copying it, or they've gone to the opposite extreme and tried to be the opposite. And neither of those things really are a formula for leadership, is my view. But I think Blair certainly did have a bit of Camelot to him. There was an Arthurian kind of template about the third way. King Arthur is, if you like, the third way.
The problem with the third way is it doesn't speak to the average person on the street. If you ask the average person on the street what Thatcherism means, I think you'd get a semi-coherent answer, even from reasonably non-political people. I think if you ask people what the third way was, you'd get from 10 people 10 really different answers. The third way, for me, always seemed to be about trying to marry free market to social justice. So the whole point of the third way is that you can let the banks make their obscene profits, and as long as you tax them healthily, that's building hospitals and all the rest of it. So, yeah, I forget what the similarly point was there, but yes, the point is that you can embrace business and a free market and all the rest of it. You almost embrace inequality in doing that, but your counter-argument is that we are funding the improvements we need. Similarly, you're not fussed about how hospitals end up being run and built and delivered, as long as they are built and run and delivered. And so if you feel you need to bring some sort of private sector expertise into that, you do it. The things that have massively undermined the third way, as far as what helps the third way, is most people don't understand what it is anyway. So what's to hurt when you can't define it? But I think what has really hurt it is the banking crash, because it was dependent on huge revenues from the banking sector, and also many NHS trusts that are in deficit now. Yes, they are being underfunded by the current government, but they are also being hurt by the fact that they're locked into expensive PFI agreements, which come from the sort of New Labour years. So I'm not really sure there's an enduring legacy there, because what the third way was an attempt for politicians to actually sort of stake out ground for themselves and define who and what they were. But they were actually answers to the political issues of those day. The political issues of the day was we'd come off a lot of years of right-wing government where people had got accustomed to at least the rhetoric of a relatively low-tax economy. Whether we had a low-tax economy is a different matter, but the rhetoric of a low-tax economy. But at the same time, they are starting to see what we're seeing now, things like the NHS creak really badly, and they want someone to come in and fix it, but they don't want someone to come in and fix it and absolutely decimate their wages with huge tax rises. The third way was only an attempt to answer that. That's all it was, and every era has to answer different questions. Thatcherism would not necessarily be a vote winner now because it would be seen as too cold and calculating and lacking in compassion and social justice.
Mm-hmm. So, to some extent, then, politics, the movements in politics, are pretty much of their time. And,
they are of their time, and I think that the danger is that it's become very binary. You look at something like the Labour Party now. We've got a relatively left-wing leader of that party, and it's seen that it has to be that or some Blair clone. And
yep.
I'm thinking, well, that is an inherent. I think it's a failure of Tony Blair actually that he didn't build for the party to be without him.
Yeah.
In any way, you know, they lost the very next election after him. A lot of that was the banking crash.
Yeah, and Brown wasn't a good performer. I mean, he was a good manager, I think, but you know, he just wasn't a particularly good public speaker or whatever.
No.
When he tried.
No, and there are some really funny. I mean, there's one. Number 10 did a YouTube video of him talking direct to camera. And it's one of the funniest things I've ever seen because he's waving his arms about and he's trying to remember to smile and he doesn't naturally smile. So now and again he throws on this kind of creepy fucking grin and then starts like deciding to sway to look all like, easygoing and stuff. I think that's part of the problem. I mean, politics is increasingly becoming the cult of personality anyway. And so it's very hard for any leader to build a movement that survives them. But not only that, the country Blair took over wasn't the country he left. He stopped serving in 2006, or 7 rather. So, the last thing the country needs at the moment is a Blair clone, and that's not actually a comment on Blair. That's just a comment on that was an answer to a question posed 20 years ago.
But that leads very neatly into the idea of film franchises and, once again, this Arthurian legacy. Because if you take I know from our previous discussions or iterations of this potential episode that you didn't grow up with the King Arthur lore in the way that you maybe did with Robin Hood, because it's obviously a natural successor to Robin Hood. So you're not really a huge aficionado, but you know the basics, right?
Barely the basics, yeah.
Okay, so you've got Knights of the Round Table is the main thing that comes out of it, right?
Yeah.
Heraldry, brotherhood, the idea of a team of beings.
And a nice table.
Yeah. IKEA. Just something like that. And
Is there a chapter where they all build it together?
That's the missing
point
legend.
A into point B.
Arthur and the Legend of the IKEA. The group of the IKEA. Actually, that is quite a good sketch. We'll send it to Python for their next reunion tour. So the idea is you've got a band of men of various skills brought together. You have a country in ruin when King Arthur, the legend of King Arthur, be it the Saxon, Roman, whichever variety it is, potentially, but possibly the actual specific origin, of course, because it's a legend, is completely open to debate. But the fact of the matter is, whatever version you take, this is somebody who takes control of a country that is at war with itself. And he reconciles the various tribes, partly through finding the best of each, bringing them together in a bond of brotherhood and blood and ideals and all the rest of it. He is a man of action, so he's not incompetent. He's obviously good at war. He wins a few, but he's not seeking war. And he's a little bit over-earnest, a little bit wordy, a little bit callow as a youth, and then even as an older man, he's a little bit too eager to think and philosophize. And then there's this business with, the Holy Grail is obviously the set-piece epic thing where they, look for the MacGuffin, which we come on to later on. And then you get the death. In exactly the same as Robin Hood. Obviously, there are disparate, many, many versions of the legend, and there's no specific canon, so to speak. There's no one definitive, Bible of King Arthur. But on the other hand, there is a sense that you can dip into these legends and get what you need from them. So you can get the rise of the hero story, or you can get knights on self-contained adventures at their peak, or you can get kind of the death of King Arthur. With just that little hint of hope sowing into the future while still being self-contained and addressing things like old age and mortality and loss and failure as a parent and failure in legacy. We talked about, political leaders earlier on. King Arthur, to some extent, fails to nominate a successor. And he's also, at the other end of the spectrum, it's quite an adult story. I mean, these are stories for kids, which adults can enjoy, because you have, in the midst of this, a nasty little domestic going on, in the sense that Guinevere, bless her, is very beautiful. I picked her blonde for some reason. Buxom, kind of voluptuous.
Although in one of the films we see she's Sherry Lungy, so...
Yeah, so it's a slightly different iteration. But yeah, for some reason, a vivacious, voluptuary Guinevere has an affair with Lancelot. Lancelot, who is this knight who's in King Arthur's court, but isn't caught up in the kind of the mythos or the philosophy. And I think the implication there, and what's very interesting, Dave, is that this stays with storytelling everywhere, is that the hero, that kids particularly, want to be at a subconscious level, maybe because of something that they see in the grown-ups that they're observing. They don't want to be the man who's entrusted with the thinking or the moral responsibility. They want to be a hero who is on the side of good, but who gets to do things like sleep with the princess or save the day, but in a manner that is still somewhat on the edge of the bad guys, insofar as the bad guys aren't out to get that hero. There is a hero who sort of rides into town, gets the girl, solves the problem, but isn't caught up in the moral texture of it. And I think from there, you get certain templates. Han Solo, James Bond, Indiana Jones, Tony Stark, and so on. Many of the heroes, certainly that I gravitate to, probably have a lot more Lancelot in them than they do King Arthur. But at the same time, the King Arthur template, particularly in Star Wars, because if we talk about The Last Jedi very briefly, a lot of the people who hate on The Last Jedi are hating what happened to Luke Skywalker. Well, they're failing to understand that Luke Skywalker is King Arthur. And King Arthur, we talk about wilderness periods for Churchill over, King Arthur has a gigantic wilderness period where not much happens to him and where he feels that he has failed. He has a last hurrah as he fades into death and passes the sword on. That is exactly Luke Skywalker. It doesn't detract from the previous heroism or the victories, but it does very much point out that this is not a non-committal hero. This is somebody who had to think a great deal and therefore had to reflect and therefore took failure in a very personal manner and therefore went into hiding. And that's why, of all the problems I have with The Last Jedi, the fate of Luke Skywalker isn't one of them. In fact, I think they handled it very well. What do you think?
Oh, the fate of Luke Skywalker. I mean, I'm going to review The Last Jedi in about 4 weeks' time. We'd already done a sort of review of it just before Christmas, and that recording failed. I'm quite happy to do it again. I don't think my opinion has changed very much in that I think the film might, without some kind of time jump, I think the film might be quite difficult to sort of fit into. I think it might have damaged the trilogy here. But the least of my problems is Luke Skywalker. It's 30 years on. People do change. People do become less idealistic. People do get jaded. People do get damaged by life. The biggest complaint I keep reading is they've pissed on the Luke Skywalker character. No, they haven't. He just hasn't developed in the direction you would have wanted. That doesn't mean you have to like it. It doesn't mean you're wrong to dislike it, by the way. But it's perfectly valid that Luke Skywalker could be that person 30 years on. So I didn't really have a problem with it.
Yep. But Luke Skywalker is, of course, the moral heart of Star Wars. He's the everyman, but he is a man on a philosophical mission, and that's probably where that disillusionment, to some extent, would have come from. And equally, I talked about the hint of hope. Well, Last Jedi does kind of give that. That leads us into another Disney product, franchise, etc., that also deals with kind of a hero.
Remaking The Fox and the Hound?
That'll come soon. They'll run out eventually. No, we are, of course, talking about Avengers: Infinity War. Did you enjoy it?
Yeah, I did. I've seen it a couple of times now. I don't have the same... It's a bit like Christmas to me. I like the build-up and the reality of it less than the build-up. I am aware that, because I've spoken to people about this film now, including you, and I come off more negative than I feel. I think this is really good, and I think it's as good as you're going to do a team-up. But I enjoy the build-up to the team-ups more than the team-ups themselves. I think they need to exist. Yep. I think if you're going to have this kind of universe, to avoid it just being cameos in each other's films, it has to all have a point and something it builds towards. And I think with that in mind, they've done a great job. They've made Thanos a bit of an all-timer of an antagonist. His plan makes no sense, though. It really doesn't. But necessarily, as you're keeping all these plates spinning, I mean, even by Civil War, I was starting to think this is overstuffed. In fact, even by Age of Ultron, because the whole Vision thing got a bit rushed. Nothing ever really gets time to breathe. So, to use a particular example, and we are going to spoil the film, you've got the Red Skull turning up for the first time since the 5th film in this franchise. We're now on film 19, and I don't think there's any plot holes there. I think we can divine where he came from and how he got there and all the rest of it. But he's now floating around looking vaguely Grim Reaper-y, and he's all knowledgeable about the Soul Stone, and he's like a guardian of it. And the film doesn't have any room to explore that. Now, I'm glad the subsequent Captain America films went in the directions they did. But I think to have covered this, you would have had to put it in one of the Captain America sequels. Not the ones we've got, but they would have had to have been shaped into a Captain America sequel. So I always find that they do a remarkable job balancing everything. I mean, even the score, we've got everyone's themes in there, and yet without it all sounding really disjointed and awful.
Yeah, no, supposed
he's done a great job.
Wrote the Captain America theme.
Well, Alan Silvestri scored the Avengers as well, so he will have done that. Yeah, exactly. So they all go together really well. The sheer amount of CG in it should have led to a load of Uncanny Valley, but there's only a couple of shots that don't look flawless. Literally 3, I think I counted, where I went, ooh. But even then, we're not talking like 2001 standard CG, we're just talking not absolutely 100% flawless. You can't with the amount of effect shots you're doing in this film. I think the cast are top notch. I think the Russos really do get good performances out of everybody. I have reservations about it. I don't like seeing... I know it happens in the comics, but that's a different format. I don't really like seeing Spider-Man on other worlds and things like that. He should be street level in New York. But, as I say, on balance, considering this is now a build-up to after 18 films, and normally by film 4 or 5 in a franchise, people are starting to go, Christ, another one. And yet, if anything, the audience feels fresh and excited for this, and what they've delivered is really impressive. We could talk in some details if you'd like, but at a broad stroke, it's as good as the team ups could be, but the team ups have a natural ceiling to how good they can be. That ceiling's really high, but you're not going to get anything transcendent. You're not going to get anything the Winter Soldier standard out of a team up. But they've done a very, very good job.
Yeah, but I mean, we talked about the Winter Soldier. I think on a subsequent podcast, Dave, we'll do the Winter Soldier as a political film, because this is one of the things that is happening in a very good way to what they call comic book or superhero cinema. It's no longer a genre; it is a platform for experimentation with genre. And
I think actually, I semi-disagree. I know what you're saying.
Yeah.
In that, say, when the first Iron Man came out. It was recognisable as the same type of film as the first Spider-Man. Yeah. In terms of being an origin story and all
and Batman Begins. There's a lot of Batman Begins.
Yeah. So I get what you're saying, but I don't think it's that it's not a genre. I think it's that they try to accentuate like a subgenre within it. So Ant-Man is a heist film. Captain America is the Marvel Universe's attempt at a sort of 70s political conspiracy thriller.
Yep.
And if I thought about it, there's others, and off the top of my head I can't think of them. But all of them, if you sit and think about them, have kind of an accentuation in the direction of a slightly different genre. And Kevin Feige has more or less said that is their aim. They sit down and they're like, what type of film do they want this to be? And Ant-Man, for example, was very much, let's make it a heist film.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my feelings on Infinity War, it's a difficult one to be completely objective, but I know for a fact, and I can only apologise to my good buddy I went to see it with, who ironically enough does look like Doctor Strange, Cumberbatch, and even has the goatee and so on. But apparently, as that film concluded, I may have been somewhat strong in my language, which I can only apologise. There were no kids around us. But it was because I thought at the time, what if there were kids? How would they feel about that film? You see, the thing about kids, I can say this as somebody who's been around them, as a teacher, as somebody who, I don't have any yet, but I can think like one. And I remember the thing about, I was quite a sensitive Arthurian rather than a Lancelot, if you want to extend the analogy, sort of a kid who thought very deeply about things, not that anyone would ever guess. And the thing is, I still feel, from what I've seen in kids, that if you give them in that age of sort of, I suppose, that kind of 11 to 15 kind of window, which is quite wide in and of itself.
That's very wide, but I know what you're saying.
Yeah, they can handle, and indeed they go and seek out actively whatever would be the equivalent of an 80s Schwarzenegger bloodbath, action, adventure, violence, blood spurts, RoboCop, that sort of thing, or, fuck you, I saw lots of language, maybe even a naughty little sex scene snuck in against parental permission in a dormitory or whatever it is. Psychological violence is a very different thing, and I mean that from whether they're the toughest of tough, kick the shit out of you bully in the playground, who's hanging a dead bird to your tie, or whether they are Mr. Sensitive who's missing mummy and daddy in a corner reading a book. And the problem I have with Avengers Infinity War is that in a couple of scenes, and notably, yes, that conclusion, that isn't a cliffhanger, it's just the conclusion of that story, and therefore prima facie ending on a downer, right down to removing the upbeat Silvestri score. And I really did get angry there and think, guys, you're not Schindler's List, you're not Godfather 2. Yes, have some stakes, have tension, but to reference Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back, yes, it ends with darkness and uncertainty, but there is just that hint of hope, and they keep the John Williams score, and they have enough momentum to propel you someplace else with just a hint of what's going to happen, while still making you wait and still having some self-contained. But above all, the scene in which Gamora is murdered by Thanos, it's not bloody, it's not gory, but they dwell on it and they freeze the atmosphere around it, and you can feel it. Now, admittedly, you're supposed to feel stuff like that, otherwise why do it? But as I say, whatever references to mythologies, including Arthurian or Greek or whatever it is, or even tragedy, this is ultimately a kid's family adventure fantasy movie. It is not meant to make you feel like shit. And it's not meant to, if he killed her with a laser beam or something, I'd be fine with that. You'd still have the stakes. You'd still have the emotion. But for some reason, the manner in which they did it, I think that's one of the a weakness is just an overdone strength, Dave. And I think the great strength of the Russos is that they have managed to take all of the cosmic level fantasy stuff without compromising it, and indeed throwing many bones to the fans of the comic books, but at the same time giving even Thanos a very human rationale and giving it a very adult, grounded logic to it, with each of the characters having quite a finite role in this infinite universe. And I think that's a thing of genius. But the payoff for that is that I think it's far too psychologically sophisticated and ambitious for what didn't need to be that way. And that's my gripe with it. But it's a good problem to have. And to those who were in the cinema and witnessed my rant as those credits rolled, I can only apologise.
I've seen it twice. The second time, I got there ahead of the start of the film, but we were deep into trailers, so I did well to just be able to find my seat, really, because it was very dark and so on. So although I was aware it was fairly full, I couldn't tell you what the profile of that audience was, and I didn't pay much attention when I left. But certainly the first night it was a Heinz 57 audience. There was everyone there, right the way back to young kids who were probably too young. I'm not a very good judge of that. We had everybody there, and I didn't note it. And the kids were engaged all the way through. I mean, I've been to see films that were ostensibly for kids in the past, and they've been, they've struggled with it. Just off the point, WALL-E's an example. WALL-E's one of the Pixar films people rave about most, but it actually fails its core audience. That if these things are first for children, even if not foremost, then an audience full of kids struggled with WALL-E because it was like 2001 / Silent Running, which kids aren't ready for. Well, they were engaged by all of this, and they weren't notably traumatized by any of it either. But I'm not a teacher. I don't spend a lot of time around kids. I think, sadly, I've missed the boat to have any myself. It's
James Bond. He's just had one at 50. Well,
but it's one of those things. I get a little sadder about it every year, to be honest. But it's one of those things that I don't think. I can only go by what I'm seeing, and what I'm seeing wasn't an audience full of anyone particularly traumatised by it. They lingered less on the fall and more on the build-up to it. But my biggest problem with that scene was the Red Skull, just because and it's not that he was there, and it's not that they brought him back, and it's not even that he's on that planet. it's that they have no time to let any of this breathe. So you just have to go, there he is, oh right. When we went back to Age of Ultron, they did it with, I think it was Age of Ultron where they did it with Vision. That was a fucking, you know, momentary, oh well, we created this thing. Pepper was not in one of those films. I think it was the Age of Ultron. Jane Foster wasn't in Avengers, and they'd always bring it up just to put some throwaway remark in, because the film doesn't have any time to deal with it properly. Like I say, on its terms of engagement, it's done a phenomenal job. But I don't need to be seeing a film with 27 fucking leads in it. I really don't. It's nice as a one-off, and it's nice that they've sort of built to this. I say a one-off, we're getting another one next year. I always get excited for them, but they can't get to me the way a Winter Soldier can. And even something like Civil War, because I think they do mix up stakes with, or notional stakes with meaningful character work. That I've given an example in the past of Star Trek Generations. Star Trek Generations, they're trying to save a planet that's got 230 million people on it at one point in the film. But we never see any of those people, so it's just a big number. Who cares? 2 films later, in what's overall a weaker film, but Insurrection, they're trying to save a village of like 600 people, but we see plenty of them. So that particular strand of the story has more stakes than 230 million people. Well, you can't get much bigger than half the universe being wiped out at the click of a finger. So I do think the stakes are almost insurpassable unless you start going for bigger percentages of the universe being wiped out. But none of it had the same impact on me as Cap and Tony fighting in Civil War, and he's my friend. I thought I was, you know, and these band all there for good being ripped apart at the seams on the basis of a failure to share an ideology. You know, they spent more time discussing the Segovia Accords than whether they should kill Vision in this film. So there is a sense.
But then he is just an android. I mean, I'm not going to
fit everything. They fit everything in.
Yeah.
They fit everything in. It hasn't got an excessive running length. Each scene gets across the information it needs to get across. They haven't messed up. They've done a fantastic job. But, big numbers and meaningful stakes aren't always the same thing. And particularly now that they've got like a time stone as well. Now they're paid to write, so I would hope they've got a bit more originality than me. I hope it's not just a straightforward turn the time stone, capture the time stone and turn it back. But some of these deaths certainly are going to be undone. I hope some of them are permanent, not because of dislike for the characters, but just because death has to mean something sometimes.
I mean, you mentioned the other day that we're not screenwriters. Well, one of the reasons that I delayed a screenplay, which I have now finished, I'm just sitting on it for a bit before I kind of farm it out, was I could not decide for the life of me whether to kill a character, even though all of the plot logic and every instinct, every objective fibre of my body said, kill them. But I do think that one of the triumphs of Infinity War is that for all of the darkness that I've mentioned and my loathing of that, there's also some constructive darkness and actual preparation, not just of kids, but of adults in a very universal manner to accept, I think, a few inevitable deaths. I think one of those is Tony Stark. He doesn't die in Infinity War, but we get a brutal quasi-death scene.
Yeah, I mean, none of the original event. I mean, I can't speak for what the audience listening to this care about and like. So your favourite character might be Black Panther. But in terms of time spent with these people, we've obviously had longest with the original gang, if you like, the original Avengers, and they all survive this film. So the ones we've known longest are still around.
Yep. And I think the thing about it is, I mean, you mentioned fatherhood earlier on, and that was quite moving, by the way. It was a bit of a curveball. But Charlie Chaplin made a baby at 80. And the person who played Charlie Chaplin better than Chaplin himself was Downey. And I do have to say, there are just, even though he doesn't get a huge amount of screen time, this is the genius of Downey, is that some of the critics point out one of the difficulties of Infinity War is that it shifts in tone from the dark to the light. There is an actor who can do it in a split second with just a look to the camera.
And there sits a universe that was built in his image anyway.
Yeah,
that's absolutely. That's what Marvel do. And
yeah.
I read a whole article today about a jokey line that came not long after. Again, we've already said spoiler alert. After Gamora's death.
Yep.
In the very next scene, there's like a light line. And they're like, well, that was too soon. And it's like, well, I've seen it twice and I've not even noticed.
Yep.
Marvel just do this stuff effortlessly. And detractors pointed it as bubblegum or light or whatever. There's plenty of stakes in these things. There's plenty of character work in these things. I do think the average standard of the Marvel films is kind of pretty averagey. But
it's deliberately. They've never tried to be something they're not.
No, but every 3 or 4 years, maybe even less than that, they absolutely, in 2014 they did The Winter Soldier and the first Guardians of the Galaxy in the same year. And I think any studio would have been proud of something like that. But they're very good at spinning on a dime, and what they're also very good at doing, and I noticed this as far back as Joss Whedon's Avengers film, that they very slowly stretched believability over time so it becomes normal. If you'd have paused the video halfway through Iron Man, taken out the disc and put in Infinity War, and he's on Titan chatting with Peter Parker and Doctor Strange, and this guy's teleporting in and out, you'd go, Christ, that bears no relevance to the same universe whatsoever. But they've done it slowly over time, and the first time it ever occurred to me was when Tony fell from space towards the end of the Avengers, and the Hulk caught him. But the way Iron Man was being smashed against things, and the way Hulk caught him, which, the guy would have just been fucking liquid goo by the end of that. But over time, we've slowly seen him take slightly bigger hits, slightly bigger hits, slightly bigger hits, until it stretches what you're willing to believe in this universe. And they've done it over 19 films expertly.
Yeah. But he is going to die, I think, in the next one. I think Doctor Strange sparing him, or asking Thanos to spare him in that split second. The fact that Thanos knew Stark specifically, and the foreshadowing, the portend of Pepper being possibly pregnant and married, that is either going to pay off as
It is the fact that, there is, there's that, isn't it? It's the fact that he's due to marry and he's having dreams about possible fatherhood. So it wouldn't be a shock. I'm not a screenwriter. I really don't want to start with the I told you so when it happens, because we don't know what's going to happen, but logically, you've got to figure he might die and she's pregnant.
Yeah. And it would also enable, in that heraldic way, passing the baton to Peter Parker. I mean, he knights him, and if he dies, he then becomes the Uncle Ben, if you like.
We never had the Uncle Ben in this universe, partly because we'd had him twice in about 10 years.
Yep.
So I don't think there was an appetite for it again, but I think actually it makes sense. He was dropped in a team-up film as well, so we didn't have time for any of that anyway. And then what are you going to do? Slow down Homecoming with flashbacks we don't need. Thematically, his mental figure is still there.
Yeah, and I think, it's Stark's archetype, because obviously, if he becomes completely the self-sacrificial character that makes everything possible, his story is at an end. And I don't know, maybe that could just be the closing shot for me of the next Avengers, maybe. I just have a feeling. Will be Pepper maybe touching her stomach. Looking up, and maybe there's a cot in the background or something.
The only thing I would say about that, of course, is it depends how much of any of it there is in the second film, because these films still have to stand alone, and we've only had about 30 seconds of Pepper. So if she stood patting a baby bump at the end, I can't see that. We'll just see.
Yeah, but just to echo the first Avengers, because bear in mind the Whedon signature is still there a little bit. The Battle of New York and whatnot, I think, will be referenced again. Although, as you point out, those leaked photographs and purple could be kind of deceptive deliberately, but they have it.
I pointed that out yesterday, actually, when we talked about this before. We had everyone said, I can't believe they rendered Hulk into that Wakanda battle and he's not in it. And I'm thinking, well, with a time stone and certain elements of this film having to be undone. There's nothing to say that's not from the next film.
Yeah.
There's also footage. There's also a toy bin released of Hulk bursting out of the Hulkbuster armor.
Yeah.
Once again, just because it hasn't happened doesn't mean it can't happen.
Yeah. I suspect there'll be a bigger role for Captain America as well, because even though, I mean, we talk about King Arthur, he is the King Arthur to some extent of the Marvel Universe, insofar as he's its moral guide. You know, the moral simplicity. Like, I mean, and despite the fact that he doesn't get much screen time in Infinity War, they do nail his character in a couple of scenes. Number one, we don't trade lives. Number two, the bit where he is introduced, and you see that actually is, despite all of his slightly over-worthy, over-earnest attitudes to life, he is a warrior. He's not someone you want to fight. And third and above all, I am Groot. I am Steve Rogers. His gentlemanly, almost childlike innocence.
They're very good at characterization through the one-liner and stuff like that,
yeah.
You know? Just absolutely terrific to just be able to just communicate. Well, a gentleman's introducing himself to me. I best do the right thing and you know, introduce myself back.
Yeah. He's a great actor as well, is Chris Evans. You know, and he's very much a theatrical actor, which is.
I need to see Chris Evans in more stuff. I mean, I've been aware of this guy for years because I mean he turned up in the previous iteration of the Fantastic Four. Played a bit of a sort of jerk in that. Obviously, in Scott Pilgrim versus the World. He was in Scott Pilgrim versus the World, which I never liked, but I know most people do.
Once.
And then he's been in all of this, and I'm just glancing through to see if there's anything I've seen him in, and I still haven't got round to Snowpiercer, and I haven't seen anything else.
Tilda Swinton's in there. You don't want to miss that. I love her.
Oh, I love Tilda Swinton.
Wonderful one.
So he is terrific. I think when I look at Chris Evans, there's a shot in the film where I just think it's amazing. You think you're getting sort of peak film star charisma on screen, and then someone else appears and just completely outshines them in one hit. And I felt like that when Thor and him were on the same screen.
Yeah.
Because actually,
you copied my beard.
Chris Hemsworth is a fucking film star. He really is.
I think he'd make a good James Bond.
We have talked about this offline at times in the past. I don't think you'll get it because I think there'll be. It's quite a conservative base. You've only got to hear Bond fans talking about fucking anything, and they're just really kind of old-fashioned in a lot of ways. And I think they would struggle with it being an Australian when the only precedent for that is Lazenby.
Yep.
I don't, because I think Australians and New Zealanders can always pass for British. They just can. I don't know what it is, but I've never heard an Australian do a British accent where they couldn't do it. Now, regional ones, maybe that's a little bit different. See Robin Hood for details.
Yes.
But certainly, he had no problem playing Aubrey, though, did he?
That's Russell Crowe. Well, Russell Crowe was, I think, at some points touted as Bond. He says he was off with it, but he may have been saying that in jest. You know, because
there was a period of time. I mean, the only thing is, I don't know if he's tall enough, and I know height doesn't matter in that. No, you would never know just from watching his films that Tom Cruise is 5'7".
No.
But if you go back and watch an early Bond film, Connery's like 6'2", 6'1" and a bit, 6'2", something like that. But he's 6'2" in an era where average height was an inch or two less than it is now.
Yep.
So it was like being 6'4" now. He towered over everyone, and he had a real. And Craig gets away with it, but when they start talking about Tom Hardy, I'm thinking, well, he's 5'9". How short are we going to go? You know, I don't hold much sacrosanct in the look of Bond.
So Hemsworth is almost too tall, isn't he?
But Hemsworth, well, no, because he's Connery adjusted for a couple of generations, isn't he? What is he?
Well, similar charisma.
What is he? 6'4"?
Something like that, yeah. And I think
that's like that's like 1962 6'2", isn't it?
If you look at Rush, where he plays James Hunt, that is Bond.
It doesn't look that big in that.
But that is Bond. He can do the character.
Well, I mean, he's vaguely impersonating James Hunt there. Anyone listening who hasn't seen it, it's a Ron Howard film from 2013. Got a very good Hans Zimmer score on it as well. It's got him and Daniel Bruhl in the two leads. Daniel Bruhl's playing a driver called Niki Lauda. If you look up Niki Lauda Nürburgring 1976, you'll see the accident that becomes a bit of a centrepiece to this film, because Niki Lauda still works in Formula One now as one of the sort of team bosses. There's a bit more to it than that, but that'll do as an outline. And he got badly burnt, but he was racing against a guy called James Hunt. James Hunt was an upper class, incorrigible drunken womanizer. Dropped dead at the age of 45 as a heart attack. And when you hear you hear stories like he went to, I think it was Japan. I don't think it was that Japan race. I don't think it was Suzuka that weekend. Oh, sorry, it wasn't Suzuka, was it? He won the title at Mount Fuji. But it wasn't that weekend. It was one race he went to where in the weekend he had sex with 33 different women.
When you such an amateur.
I know, and it's just, that's a lunch hour, surely. Yeah. But, no, James Hunt was, he wasn't quite as good looking as Chris Hemsworth, but there's enough of the spirit of the guy in the performance. He can do a British accent, and
he can do a slightly sensitive take on.
It's whether they'll go blonde again, but he's just unbelievably charming, and he's growing into his looks as well, because you never know with actors. Sometimes they look fantastic at 25. You see him at 35, and suddenly it's like, what happened? Yeah. Chris Hemsworth started playing Thor in his late 20s. He played George Kirk in Star Trek at the age of about 24.
He's about to do that again.
Filming, that is. He was about 26 by the time it was released. And yet, you actually see him as Thor now, and he looks better than he did then. It's whether they'll go blonde and all that, and it's whether they'll go Australian. But
it's whether they make a Bond film at all.
Well, I mean, if they stick to the schedule, which is a big if, you've got to think they'll want to do something for their 60th anniversary.
Yeah, totally.
When that year rolls around, that is the year Chris Hemsworth turns 39.
So perfect.
I would say that's pretty perfect to start your run.
I might put a bet in now.
But it's a long shot, but then long shots do pay off sometimes. So
one final shout out. I thought Chris Pratt was very funny, especially when he sees Doctor Strange and goes, "Who are you, Jesus?" or something. I thought that was quite funny. And he went well.
The humour just landed. I mean, Drax was terrific.
Why is Gamora?
Why is Gamora was a brilliant line, but it was also the standing still bit. And that was most of the humour was just, what situation am I in? A bit like Bond films when they're written properly, where you go, right, what's the obvious funny line here? And it's done that way round. That's probably the only sequence I can think of in the film where there is no reason for that bit, it's just funny.
But to reference the counterpart to Marvel, DC, Justice League, Henry Cavill was frequently asked on the promotional tours. I don't know why my voice has sort of gone into that sort of Henry Cavill rhythm, as I'm saying Henry Cavill, because he has a certain rhythm to his voice. He has a rhythm to his voice. But he was asked a lot about, is Justice League a bit funnier and a bit more light than Batman Superman? And he was very curious. I said, well, look, I've got a lot of relatives and friends. Doing it again. I'm channeling it. Stop it, James. Got a lot of relatives and friends who were in the military. And they use gallows humour because they are dealing with matters of life and death. And the humour comes naturally. It doesn't mean that you're unprofessional. It doesn't mean that you're forcing humour where there is none. It means that you're using humour as a kind of a last line of insulating defence against what is a dark situation against which you have no power other than what you've got together to fight with. And he said that was what was in Justice League something. And whether that came across or not, when we talk about the Arthurian template, they were clearly setting up the idea of a round table with the superheroes and so on. But I think Marvel, whatever about whether Justice League nailed it, I still think they did to some extent. I've got a real soft spot for Justice League for all of its many, many flaws. But I think that Marvel certainly nailed it in the sense of, the humour, yes, it's there, but it's there naturally. It's not goofy, it's not silly, it's not tagged on. And it at no stage
it's largely funny, and that's all that actually matters.
Yeah, but it was also tense. I was literally on the edge of my seat in that movie, and I haven't had that in a comic book or action movie in a very long time. The moment I thought my beloved Stark was gone, I took off my 3D glasses, pulled my eyes out, and my hand was literally digging into the chair. That is a testament to brilliant direction, writing, and of course acting. Dear old Robert Downey Jr. Shall we take a commercial break there? Because we're coming naturally into the actual King Arthur stuff. End of part one. Okay, so for the King Arthur segment, the actual King Arthur bits, obviously Hollywood has a gigantic canon of actual Arthur movies, rather than just, as I say, that the motifs which have segged into stuff like, Star Wars or Bond or Marvel and whatnot. A definitive version came in the 1950s. You had Knights of the Round Table, which is well worth looking. You can get it on Amazon. Amazon, Watch Direct. Then there was one I toyed with including, and I did have another look at it. It's called First Night from 1995, and that has Sean Connery playing King Arthur, which is interesting because he had also played Robin Hood. It doesn't quite work because they use the mythology and yet they dispense with the magical side of it, which would have justified having things like Round Table and knights and whatnot. And they have the centerpiece is the affair between Lancelot and Guinevere. But Lancelot is miscast as Richard Gere, because Richard Gere, although he's a fantastic actor, in fact I think he's among the greats, he spent his whole career shunning action-adventure parts for some reason, and when he finally decides to take a few on, it's a little bit later in his career, he doesn't, for me, convince as Lancelot. And, there were some critics even who, I think, bitchily, cattily sort of mentioned stuff like, well, Sean Connery, who was then 65, but still a force to be reckoned with, and masculine and virile and the rest of it, would still have taken Richard Gere's Lancelot no problem, and that Julia Ormond, forced to choose between the two of them, would have taken Connery. But it is a curiosity. It's you might want to look at it, but it's not a definitive King Arthur film by any means, and it has certain revisionist intentions, but doesn't go all the way with it. Yeah, I think you can take or leave it, frankly. So what we've gone with are the John Boorman Excalibur. We have included as well the Anton Fuqua Clive Owen 2004 King Arthur, and we look at the Guy Ritchie Legend of the Sword of the Curse of the whatever it is, just King Arthur Legend of the Sword, I think they call it in the end. And before going on to Monty Python's Holy Grail, and then finishing off on a positive note with Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, which, although not a King Arthur film, obviously trades on the Arthurian lore of the Grail and has at its heart a father-son relationship between a quasi-Galahad and Lancelot in Indiana Jones and his dad. Sean Connery again, there with Harrison Ford. So Dave, which one do you want to go with first?
Let's do the Arthurian ones first, so maybe Excalibur?
Okay. So, first impressions. Shoot from the hip.
I watched it and all I could think was, if Bonnie Tyler and Renee and Renata had all done music videos that were all based in Arthurian times, this is what they would look like. They've all got that smoky soft focus effect on them. Heavily stylized. Doesn't look like anything else John Boorman did. I mean, this is a guy who did Deliverance and I think Point Blank. He also did The Tailor of Panama, which is probably Pierce Brosnan's finest hour in my opinion. What we've ended up here with is a film that I just thought was fascinating for the first maybe 20 minutes. Gabriel Byrne playing Uther Pendragon. Not the Gabriel Byrne we came to know. It looks like him, but he's not acting like him in any way at all. And we get the whole background of him sort of conceiving Arthur effectively. And it's very... what's the word? It's... yeah, I really don't know what they were trying to achieve with this film. It's very like... Homeric stuff. Like, if you think of the Odyssey with the sirens, where you've just got to have them, you've just got to have them, you've just got to have them. That's exactly how they characterise Uther Pendragon, wanting, what's she called?
Yeah, I mean it's a pop video, isn't it? Really,
absolutely.
To some extent.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't mean to be, but I mean that's what it is, and I think it's a pop video with classical, operatic, theatrical flavour. Ironically enough, because of that, it's not terribly substantial, because at the same time as trying to be quite superficial and visually stimulating, it's also trying over-ambitiously to cover the entire Arthurian lore from beginning to end.
It's trying to do too much. The film is trying to do far too much. There's no doubt. We've got time jumps. Yeah. We've got so many casting similarities between different people. You forget which one you're looking at half the time. Anyway, it is shot beautifully in its way, as stylized as it is. I mean, the casting in this and the costumes in it make the women just look so beautiful in this as well, that they kind of sell you why they're so wanted. Yeah,
I mean, let's talk about women. I mean, Helen Mirren is very sexy as Morgan Le Fay. no question.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's one of her finest performances as well. And Liam Neeson, it's actually quite tender. It's a lovely thing that Liam Neeson and her had a relationship, which I think started on this set. And they were on Graham Norton together recently. And Liam Neeson was recalling, he just said, look, I walked past you in your costume on set, and I nudged my best buddy Kieran Hines, who was on the set. And we just went, yeah, cool, she's lovely. And it's just a lovely, lovely idea. They don't have many scenes together, but you can tell that was probably a beautiful pairing where they just smoked, drank, probably shagged quite a lot, and saw the world together. And it's a lovely, and they've obviously remained friends, which is also lovely. But Guinevere is of course played by Sherry Lungi, which is a different sort of Guinevere. Because as I say, I know I do, as you know, have a tendency to impose my visual coders onto film franchises that I watch, which is why I get attached to certain characters or actors, whatever. But Guinevere, traditionally as painted, tends to be this kind of blonde voluptuary, and I say that with a reference to, there was a novel published about, I don't know, nearly 20 years ago called Guinevere, Queen of the Summer Country, or some county, and it was a big hit, particularly in America. I remember seeing it in a Barnes & Noble store in New York around some 2000. And at the time I had this massive crush on one of my best friends that happened. And she looked, and her name was a derivative of Guinevere. And she looked exactly like the girl on the book cover. I even brought it to my mum and I said, who's that look like? She looked like my friend, the Guinevere one. And the characters were quite similar in the sense that this friend of mine was desired by all of the boys, but at the same time she was very much a powerful woman in her own right, who had a great sense of theatre and politics and was a great moral example. Well, Guinevere, as a character in the legends, is somebody who's trapped between the worlds of being kind of the token damsel in distress who has to be saved by a Lancelot or married by an Arthur, but at the same time she is somebody who independently has to strive to craft relationships with all these different men. And I think it's a fascinating, timeless character study in terms of pre-feminist or post-feminist filters. What is a powerful woman? Well, a powerful woman has to trade on whatever she's got, including feminine allure and vulnerability that can go with that, but weaponizing that into a strength where need be for her own survival and that of her line. And I think that is Guinevere to me in a nutshell. And Sherry Lungi captures that because it's a very vulnerable, very feminine performance, but she's also very rational, and she's the one saying to all of the men, look, just stop it. I don't want to be venerated. I don't want to be put on a pedestal or a platform, but I want to survive. And in that sense, there's an inevitability about the relationship that she has with Lancelot, but also a tragedy to it, an immediate tragedy, and also Arthur's response to it.
I was always confused why she wasn't a bigger star. Not because I think she's particularly amazing or anything, but just because I think she had a unique look to her, and you're always looking for something different. So I'm surprised Sherry Lungi. I know her from she appears in the odd detective thing here and there for the odd episode. She was in a Level 42 video in the mid-80s, that always stuck out because she played what you'd expect her to play, which is basically an untouchable, silent object of desire, really. And she was also in a TV show on, I think it was Channel 4, but I'm not convinced, called The Manageress, which was just trying to cash in on the football craze in the early 90s, around the time the Premiership started, where she played the manager of a football club. And I've really not seen her in much since. And when you actually see her in a John Boorman film, when she's relatively young, and think, actually, we never saw that much more of her afterwards, is a bit of a surprise.
Yeah. Well, I think she may well have made certain career decisions. I mean, you can have a solid career in television, particularly British television.
I'm not saying she's had a poor career, but
be aware of it. Yeah. No, but she should have been. I agree with you, a marquee kind of cinema star. She has presence and she has an elegance. There is a svelte glamour to the manner in which she moves, and that's why she was excellent on Strictly Come Dancing. Wish she'd lasted a bit longer on that, actually. And she has matured.
The other thing that stood out, of course, was Patrick Stewart, small role in this early in the film. But apart from that...
this is pre-Star Trek, of course. It's a couple of years before Star Trek.
It's about 6 years before Star Trek. It's post-I, Claudius, though. But it's very... I don't know what the film's trying to achieve. It's very, very episodic, without meaning to be. I don't think it's meant to be a series of unconnected bits. but it ends up being that way because of the amount of time jumping and the fact that they're just trying to tell too big a story. Do you know what I mean? And I was struggling by the end because I was starting to struggle.
They're trying to cover the entire canon.
And the thing is, as well, if you get relatively similar looking people, and one's got a beard and one hasn't, and later one grows a beard and the other one maybe loses theirs, you do start struggling with who's who in this. But
yeah. But it does, I mean, it's a solid performance from Arthur. We've got a good Merlin in it. It captures the sort of the Machiavellian manipulations of Merlin. We mentioned the Blair era earlier on. I mean, every political era has a sort of a godfather or a guy pulling the strings. Sort of a kingmaker. I suppose Mandelson would be the Merlin of New Labour, if you like, or whatever. Yeah. In this, Merlin is portrayed as somebody who's involved and yet not involved. And when I talked about the other franchises, I mentioned Lancelot as the guy who's sort of involved and yet not involved. Well, Merlin has a similar thing. And when I think Star Wars, Dave, and just bear with me on this one, there's a moment in A New Hope, Episode 4, the original Star Wars, where Alec Guinness's Obi-Wan Kenobi gives a look to Harrison Ford's Han Solo as if to say, yeah, I actually understand exactly how you think, as in I kind of am cut from a similar cloth, or I'd like to think I am. And one of the things I think the prequels got right was casting Ewan McGregor, insofar as I think he could have captured a younger version of that. But one of the things they got wrong was that they had him play it almost like an old man in a young man's body. When they got him to Obi-Wan,
play Alec Guinness. And actually, you don't. You need to play Alec Guinness 40 years ago. He should have been watching Kind Hots and Coronets, not Star Wars.
Yeah, that's right. But no, I mean, I think, and Arthur in Excalibur, the actor, I mean, he's dead now, isn't he? Is it Nigel Terry? Is that his name?
Yeah, he died of, I think he died of cancer a few years ago. Yeah.
I think what he does very well is he ages very well during the course of the film. It's believable aging. He plays a young man very well. He plays an old man. He plays the bits in between. He's quite likable. But at the same time, in little looks to the camera manages to capture the sense that Arthur has limitations, and Arthur is frightened, and Arthur has a destiny that perhaps he didn't necessarily want, but has to fulfill, and he's very thoughtful and so on. And as I say, because they do from beginning to end, you get the death of Arthur, and you get that hint of hope, just that little nod that however dark things have been, and it is a very dark film, it is a very adult film, it's a very sexualized film, as I say, for all of its accessibility. But there is at least that kind of Lady in the Lake moment, that the once and future king will pass on the torch. And as I say, the one thing I thought was missing from Infinity War, and to some extent Star Wars might be in danger of losing, is nowadays just that hint of however dark things get. And yes, go to dark places. Yes, go to the end of the world. Go to the Armageddon. Go to the end of all things. But just have that little hint that whatever comes next, there is something next. And I think Excalibur, for all of its nihilism in places and for all of its self-contained episodic pop video aesthetic and Wagnerian brutality, manages to just keep that little hint of hope. And I think you see all the best of Boorman in that. There's a lot of is it the Emerald Forest he did?
I can't remember off the top of my head. I can think of a handful of his films. I haven't seen the Emerald Forest.
He's good at shooting landscape. He's very gifted at landscape.
Well, even the Tailor of Panama, there's a lot of lakeside. Yeah, even the Tailor of Panama, there's a lot of lakeside stuff, and Deliverance is largely outdoors and all the rest of it. Yeah, the guy's good with location.
I think one of the caricatures from Deliverance is the idea that all of the people in Deliverance probably would have voted a certain way in a certain election. Anyway, moving swiftly on. So Excalibur is a sort of a semi-recommend. I don't hate it. I don't love it. I don't feel like I would have missed something by not seeing it, but it's a curiosity. And I think for the historical value of seeing those actors and seeing the style of the time, yeah, you could do worse.
And it's actually in the new sort of DC extended universe. It's the film that Bruce and Martha Wayne had taken Bruce to. They die leaving the cinema after that film. In original tellings of that Batman tale, they were at the Mark of Zorro. Whether there's anything to that, I don't know.
Well, you can see why Zack Snyder likes it. It's one of Zack Snyder's favourite movies, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
He likes that. And then, of course, Batman and Superman are themselves, I suppose, one, if you really stretch this analogy. No, it's not that much of a stretch at all. What am I saying? They wear heraldic symbols.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of Zorro in Batman as well, so they definitely chose that deliberately back in the day. Whether they did with that, I don't know.
And Superman is that Arthurian ideal, because Superman's all about doing the right thing, the good thing, and building community. And Batman is sort of, I guess, a more Lancelot in the shadows sort of a figure. But it's interesting. But equally, Batman is quite a thoughtful character who's obsessed with crafting, sort of turning Gotham into his own kingdom. It's one of the things that the Dark Knight does. It's a bit didactic in how it does it, and as you know, I'm not fond of the dialogue in it. But thematically, it builds that idea that actually you can't just be a vigilante in the shadows, because you've chosen to be that for a reason. There is an ideology behind that, and therefore you are making a political statement which by nature.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So that leads us into the Clive Owen version from 2004. Now, tell me about Clive Owen. You don't rate him as a leading man. You rate him as an actor.
He's not a leading man. I mean, I've seen him in stuff like Croupier, where he was a very passive figure, watching the world. It's a completely different film, but it's not unlike Willard in like Apocalypse Now or something. This guy is just watching what goes on around him, and he's very good at that. Daniel Craig's very good at that as well, thinking of sort of the Bond connections. But the other thing I can always think of him in was Closer, the Mike Nichols film, where there's a scene in it where he's in an instant message conversation with Jude Law, and Jude Law thinks he's talking to a woman, and so he's winding him up with lots of sort of sexual banter and stuff, and he's really funny there. So it's not that I think he's bad, it's that I think he doesn't really command a screen, and I think on top of that, he does have a very unfortunate voice. I've always found Clive Owen's voice very boring, and I struggle to stay awake. And when you've got a film like this, which takes a beautiful landscape, I mean, I think this was largely shot in Ireland. This should be a beautiful film, but it's kind of dour, and the film is really dour. And again, I'm not quite sure what it's trying to achieve. It's got an exceptional cast. It's not set in the Arthurian era we know. It's late Roman, and I don't know what the film is.
It's Roman, isn't it? They're trying to redo Gladiator.
Probably, looking at it.
I mean, Russell Crowe was offered this.
I don't know. Possibly so, but
there was this sort of sword and sandals boom that happened.
This
after
is 5
Gladiator,
years.
wasn't it?
This is 6 years after Gladiator, though. So that does surprise me. Trends take 3 or 4 years to run through, but yeah, maybe it was still sort of the
same year as Troy, which tries a similar thing.
Troy was... Oh, yeah, no, it's 4 years. Yeah. Troy is 2004 as well, and not a great film. So, yeah.
Yeah, because it gets rid of the mythology. And I think this is one of the problems with Arthur, is like, do you go there in supernatural or do you not? I think, the Anton Fuqua 2004 version tries to hint at the idea that, yes, the Celtic Druid cults were dabbling with mythology, but it's basically talking about the emergence of Christianity in a Roman Empire. There's nothing supernatural. I mean, obviously it's a belief in a religious system, but what I'm saying is you don't get the kind of an Ark of the Covenant revelatory moment where magic is in this universe. Yeah?
Absolutely not. No, you're right. Yeah, absolutely. I just found it a struggle. And the thing is, that's not even revisionist. When it came out to a bunch of 2-star reviews saying it's kind of boring. And it is. That's quite a reductive way to look at a film, in that, like, I'm not sat here saying anything particularly thought-provoking about it, but actually the reviews in their most basic terms are right. This film's kind of dull, and it frustrated me because
it's worthy. It's dull.
It's worthy, and that's the problem. I mean, Excalibur, I struggled to get through its entire running time. We're sat here doing this as a sort of companion piece to our Robin Hood show, where all of the films were kind of all right, even with their flaws. And here we're like 2 down, and I'm struggling. This was probably the biggest struggle of any of them, though, because I don't know what the film's here for. I don't know what it's trying to tell us about Arthur.
I'm going to be honest. I fell asleep. twice trying to watch it.
I don't know what's it trying to tell us. What is the through line of this film? What are we supposed to come out of this film thinking about what we've just seen? I really, really don't know. I wasn't angry with it. I was just bored. It doesn't. It's the worst kind of film, in that you go and see things sometimes and they just make you angry or worked up or disappointed or whatever. This film, I'm struggling to feel anything for. I struggled through its running time terribly. I didn't think the action was particularly good. I didn't think the acting was particularly good for such a good cast. I thought it took some beautiful locations and made the cinematography really flat. And consequently, I've come out of this film thinking nothing at all, really. And that's a shame. That's the worst thing to come out of a film thinking, where you just come out thinking, dunno.
You mentioned the cast. We've got Jon Griffith.
Yeah.
Hornblower.
Yeah.
Who was at one stage a possible Bond, was he?
I don't know if he was ever in
or is that
consideration. No, I don't know. I don't know if he was ever in consideration at all, but he was mentioned, but then people
Joel
of the
Edgerton.
right age.
Joel Edgerton.
Joel Edgerton, who I still know best.
Joel Edgerton.
Yeah, I mean, he's been in lots of stuff. I tend to think of him for some of his lesser stuff, in that he was in the Star Wars prequels as Owen Lars, as a younger man. And he was also in the Thing prequel, if you like. It's effectively a remake. But
he looks a bit like Kurt Russell, doesn't he? So.
Well, he's not playing Kurt Russell. He's playing one of the sort of Norwegian guys, I think it is. Because obviously at the start of the Thing, you've got that dog running towards the American camp. And this is the story of that camp he was running from. Nothing film, really. I mean, in its beats, it's fine.
Mads Mikkelsen is in it too, isn't he? Mads Mikkelsen's in this.
Mads Mikkelsen, obviously another Bond reference, because... but Mads Mikkelsen, obviously now, Le Chiffre, Hannibal, Caecilius, I can't remember if that's how you pronounce it, the guy in Doctor Strange. He's been in lots of things. I mean, this has
and
a
Rogue
fine...
One, of course.
This wastes... Yeah, Galen Erso in that. He wastes... they waste a very, very good cast here, just because I don't know what it's for. I don't know what it's trying to do. I don't know what I'm supposed to think. And
Ken Scott has a very funny accent in it, doesn't he?
He does. I feel very sorry for Clive Owen actually coming out of this film, because again, on paper, Anton Fuqua's been involved in an Oscar-winning film in the last few years, albeit, I mean, it was the acting award in Training Day. He's done The Equalizer and some other stuff like that since. But this should have been a lot more entertaining, that's what it lacks. It doesn't really have any great entertainment value.
Keira Knightley's solid in it, and this was just post-Pirates, wasn't it?
Post-Pirates, year after Pirates,
a
few months after Love Actually, about 2 years after Bend It Like Beckham. This was still part of our initial sort of coming out party. Yeah, definitely.
And fantastic score from Hans Zimmer. Not necessarily one of his more memorable ones, but you can listen to it.
Enjoyable in the moment, yeah.
Yeah, some good atmospherics. But so I mean, the reason Clive gets this gig, they actually did, as I've said this before, they wanted to cast Daniel Craig. Anton Fuqua wanted Daniel Craig to play King Arthur in this. Daniel Craig at this stage is still, an actor for hire. He's doing some television work and he's got movies, but he's not a name. He's pre-Bond. It's Jerry Bruckheimer who says, well, if we're going to get a British actor, we need some Bond buzz around them. And at the time, however erroneously in retrospect, Clive Owen appeared to be in the frame. Pierce was done with Bond at this stage. He'd officially said that they'd parted company, and it appeared to be up for grabs. But a year later, they make the announcement. And certainly Clive Owen, when he was on talk show circuits, whatever it was following him, I remember he was on John Ross to promote this. And John Ross goes, can we talk Bond? And Clive Owen starts stroking his ear in that way that's usually kind of the basement. Well, don't want to talk Bond, don't want to talk Bond. And John Ross goes, what do you mean you don't want to talk Bond? Fucking talk show, talk Bond. I expect you to talk, Mr. Bond. So there was certainly something, whether you're of the view, and I think most fandom is of the view, that there was never any official discussion, and that Bruckheimer had it completely wrong. And
well, hang on a minute. It depends what you mean by official discussion. There is a long way to go from a phone call saying, would you be interested in being in consideration, to being in consideration. What I do know is he wasn't going to... Pierce Brosnan was, safe as houses through about 2003, probably.
Mm.
That year after Die Another Day, they probably started thinking, well, where do we go next? And the next thing we know that the first person in Barbara's mind was Daniel Craig. We know that they did a search and talked to a couple of hundred people, and we know they got down to a final 5 that Clive Owen wasn't part of. So whether he was one of that couple of hundred, I don't know. But I don't honestly believe Clive Owen was ever in consideration. I think it's very like when you watch Batman vs Superman, or when that film was announced, and we knew Lex Luthor was in it, people were saying, it needs to be Bryan Cranston. And they'd say it needs to be Bryan Cranston because he'd been bald in Breaking Bad, because the character had cancer. And I think there's a little bit of that with Clive Owen. What his probably best known role at that point, big screen, his best known role was probably the Chancellor on TV. But his best known role, big screen, prior to this film, was probably croupier, and he spent a lot of that film in a dinner jacket because he was playing a croupier, and they often dress black tie, depending on the casino, obviously. And I just think it's lazy. I just think you look at him and go, well, he's in his late 30s, he's wearing a tux, women kind of like him, Bond. And I've never seen any evidence or discussion that he ever had a screen test, that he ever had a conversation with anyone about anything. If he did have a conversation, I'm getting the impression it would have been like Timothy Dalton in the early 70s, where they called and said, you know, the agent, and said, might you be interested in taking any of this further? And in that case, he said, no, I'm too young. Well, in this case, Clive Owen might have said no. But when we get to the final 5, after which there was a final 2, he wasn't in it. So I don't know that he was ever in consideration. I think once you go and cast a blonde Bond, with some similarities to Clive Owen, because Clive Owen's and Daniel Craig are both kind of passive actors. They both have a slight similarity in their screen presence, but one's a film star and one isn't. So I can see why, if you get the guy you don't want, i.e. Daniel Craig, and some people didn't want him, you might go, well, we got another version of that in Clive Owen, who looks a lot more stereotypically the Fleming version of the character. But as far as I know, he was never in serious consideration. That doesn't mean he wasn't in consideration, but I think when I talk serious consideration, I'm talking final few, and he wasn't in that.
Politics of Bond are quite interesting, actually. It's one of the things that fans speculate on. Timothy Dalton recently gave some sort of interview, or it was I don't know, maybe it was a quote from a previous interview, where he admitted, yeah, actually, there was a quasi-offer to come back and do GoldenEye, and the way that he viewed GoldenEye, which actually makes a lot of sense when you look at GoldenEye, was sort of a greatest hits kind, and let's take the best of License to Kill and Living Daylights, but make a slightly more accessible version of it, and sort of wind up my era. Whereas I think Cubby Brock, as he portrays it, the idea was, and Cubby Brock was sort of, well, no, Tim, it doesn't work that way. If we make you an offer to play Bond, it's an investment. We're not going to invest a marketing push and a budget and so on in someone who's going to bugger off after one and done, because effectively this is a soft reboot and we're trying to relaunch the series. Is that do you rate that at all? Do you think that's how it went down? Or?
I have no reason to think Timothy Dalton is lying, but I don't think the official story has always been the studio didn't want him. Now, the official story, the best known version of the story, because there is no official story. I don't actually think the two are mutually exclusive, because if you're Cubby Broccoli and you've got the studio saying, we don't want that guy again, the last film flopped, he's getting to the end of his 40s now, he's not what we want, go and get that guy you nearly got before, Pierce Brosnan, people like him and everything else. Well, if I'm Cubby Broccoli and I'm committed to my choice being Timothy Dalton, I think the best thing I could actually do is go to Timothy Dalton and start to sketch out like a longer term game plan that I can go to the studio with and say, look, all right, he might be near the end of his 40s, but we've got this plan where every 2 years we're going to do a Bond film. We'd be 49 on the first one, or whatever he might be. We're going to do 4 with him, and then we can, recast or whatever. I don't think that's mutually exclusive. Remember, Cubby Broccoli is not the studio. He's not MGM or MGM United Artists. So I tend to think all versions of the story might be true. The studio looked at the performance of License to Kill, looked at the performance of The Living Daylights, which was decent, but only like Octopussy level decent, and go, okay, this series is stagnating. We've gone away for years. We've got to come back with a plan for somebody who's going to stick around for a bit, and we can reposition this series and build it as something fresh, Cold War. And we don't actually want, by fresh, we need somebody new. And actually, we think we could have made an easier marketing job of that guy they nearly took last time. That's not mutually exclusive to Cubby Broccoli fighting the corner for the guy and saying, well, like, okay, I still want you, but if it's going to be you, we've got to have a plan that you stick around a while.
I mean, it's interesting because on the one hand, it shows great naivety on Tim's part, and it shows his sort of one of the reasons I really admire him and like him is that he is a solid theatrical craftsman who probably should be right up there with Laurence Olivier in terms of how he's viewed, and certainly was compared to Olivier, but probably wasn't the best kind of yes man at the corporate level, and it just had a disinterest.
You look at him, and he's not the prettiest of the Bond actors compared to like a Brosnan.
He's handsome. He's weathered.
I'm not saying he's not handsome, but he's not pretty. He's
Yep.
not as fun and easy an interview as a Pierce Brosnan. Pierce Brosnan's fun when he goes on
That's because
morning
Pierce
shows.
gets to talk about his favourite subject, which is himself.
Yeah, but he goes on to these morning shows in America, and he's light and easy and fun, and he's inside the actor's studio is very good. Go and watch Timothy when he was announced for The Living Daylights, cigarette in hand, saying he's going to honour the work of Ian Fleming, which is all perfectly laudable, but he's slightly shy. This guy has been in the public eye for how many years? At least Flash Gordon, which is 1980. That's 38 years ago, and no one can tell you definitively if he was born in 1944 or 1946.
That's just credit.
Well, yeah, but he's a private guy. When Mel Gibson had that business of the voicemail messages with the mother of his child, who was saying, "Do you want to get beaten up by some?" and he used the N-word and so on. That woman he'd had a child with already had a child with Timothy Dalton. People don't know that. There's rumours of a longish-term relationship with Whoopi Goldberg. He doesn't talk about any of this stuff. He's about the work. He's a private guy. But if you're bringing back a series that's now got to compete in a new era with, nascent CG and things like that, I can see why they didn't want Timothy Dalton. I love Timothy Dalton as James Bond, but License to Kill, if I was running a studio, I would look at that and say, got to start again. What didn't help is License to Kill was directed by John Glenn, who I like, but it puts him in that 80s era with Roger Moore in everything. So when you get a fresh voice and a fresh cinematographer and a fresh title designer in Daniel Kleinman and stuff, it stands to reason, let's get a new man.
Yeah. Interesting. Incidentally, of course, Mel has, reformed. He hugged his cactus and all the rest of it. So there was a sort of a quasi-happy ending to all that. But I did meet Tim. I was 8 years old, and I went to see A Touch of the Poet, which is a very long play. It's Eugene O'Neill. I think that Robert Downey's line in Age of Ultron, as he goes, "It's long, Eugene O'Neill, long." It was, but I got to meet him afterwards. I was a precocious 8-year-old asking very over-earnest questions. He stood there, he answered them all, and it was absolutely lovely. He did look a little bit confused and traumatized, but he did look amazing in a fisherman's sweater. And one of the things I take away from the Dalton era is that the fisherman's sweater. And the Brosnan Goldeneye, I think one of the reasons it works, Dave, is that it is theoretically a foot in both camps, because it's one of Pierce's better performances, by Pierce's own admission, partly because it's written with the kind of substance that would have matched a Dalton level thing. There's some in-series continuity. One could argue the psychological evaluation Bond is having at the beginning of that is a product of his breakdown in License to Kill. But at the same time, it's buying more into the sort of the fantasy side of the Batmans and the aesthetic of that, which gets one into the fantasy. But we're in danger of sagging away from that, although what I would say is Pierce always viewed Bond very much in an Arthurian template, to the extent that he sort of thought of Q as the Merlin of the piece. Now, another Bond candidate, at least in theory, although once again we don't know how official, which moves us into the next King Arthur movie, was Jude Law. I remember seeing The Talented Mr. Ripley, and there's a shot of him on a boat there, which was using a lot of publicity stills, and I just thought, that guy could do Bond.
Yeah, but you're thinking Fleming Bond, aren't you?
Yeah, I know, totally, yeah. So we go to King Arthur. King Arthur Legend. What is it called? Is it Legend of the Sword? Legend of the
I think
Legend of the fucking hard man.
I think it's Legend of the Sword, Geezer.
Right. Yeah, Legend of the Geezer. This film does not work, despite being having everything on paper that should have worked.
It started all right because I saw Eric Bana, and Eric Bana just impresses me more and more over time. Now he's taking his time to do that because he's pushing 50 now, and it's only in recent years I've gone, yeah, Eric Bana, I like you. He was Hector in Troy, and that couldn't have been more perfect casting. I mean, in my head it was somebody else, but translated to the era in which it was made, he would have been perfect for Hector. And that was all great, and I thought, it's really set this up quite nicely. And we get Arthur sort of deposited in London, so he can grow up to be a Guy Ritchie character. And beyond that, I've got no idea what to make of this. It is so Guy Ritchie, it hurts. And when you think he'd only just made The Man from U.N.C.L.E., which he eschewed a lot of his own style in that film, I was a bit surprised.
Yes. I mean, it's, once again, you have the problem of Guy Ritchie's template, which does work in certain worlds. I mean, I think it works fantastically well for me, anyway, in the two Sherlock Holmes films with Robert Downey, but doesn't work so well for me in a lot of the gangster films that he made his name with, which is this idea that you can be... I don't know whether this is inverted snobbery on my part, but I remember feeling it when it first came out, and it kind of permeated the whole of society and media, which is the idea that you can be a middle-class kind of or not just middle class, but actually a squire lord of the mansion, but you can then hang out with the gangsters. And yes, in theory, that's possible, and yes, there are people that do that, but I just think, generally speaking, you're either one or the other. Because we started this podcast with the idea of class and division, and okay, it's not quite a caste system, but there is nonetheless. I'm not going to hang out with Dodgy Dave the Dagger from Dagenham. I mean, I did once meet a guy like that at the Oxford Union. Actually, bizarrely got on quite well. But I went away thinking, how did I talk to that guy, and how did he talk to me? How was he so patient with me, etc. But Guy Ritchie has this idea that the gangster can also be the lord of the manor, who in turn can be the hero. And that's fine in maybe a couple of movies, but it's his signature, alongside the editing. And he's a great editor. He's got a great visual scheme. And bizarrely, in this King Arthur movie, there's not a lot of that, when there should be. There should be a lot of it. So there's something missing from it. There's the Guy Ritchie, the worst bits of Guy Ritchie there, but the best bits aren't. And that, for me, is why it fails. There's also the mythological side, the magical. I don't think aesthetically it works. They have this grotesque bit with these sort of swarming, snake-like, fat, underwater nymphs who turn into really ugly manifestations of evil, and they're called the Mage, I think, or the Mage, or whatever, which is I know it's not a Madonna in joke, but he was married to someone called Madonna. Yeah, I mean, you can't help it. I mean, and I know it's not intentional, but it's coincidental and an unfortunate coincidence, shall we say? I think Charlie Hunnam isn't particularly well served by it, because he's having to do this Mockney twat accent. But physically,
it's difficult to do that and then be portrayed as a leader of people at the same time.
Yeah, it's fine.
I'm not saying Cockneys can't lead people, but if you're working on your affectations at the same time, it's difficult.
Yeah, this is why I think when I heard Jude Law was going to be in it, I was hoping he might be Arthur or something like that.
Jude Law might be one of the most overrated talents we have.
Overrated or underrated?
Underrated. I think Jude Law's terrific in most things, but he was a bit of a pretty boy, and now you see him now and again. And he's a bit better than that, really.
Well, he's going to be in this Fantastic Beasts. He's going to be in Captain Marvel on a Marvel issue. But I think there was a tendency, I suppose, for him to be rent-a-Brit. A little bit like Hugh Grant. Hugh Grant, of course, who was theoretically, just back to Bond for a second, although he was never once again officially confirmed. But I remember, if you go back to Four Weddings, one of the reasons that had a big opening weekend was there was Bond buzz, and with talented Mr. Ripley in a very similar way. Once again, everybody thought Bond, because it's the signature British role. They've tried to put him in rom-coms, and that doesn't really work. I mean, there's The Holiday, where he's with Kate Winslet and Cameron Diaz, and it's fine.
That's just a bad film. That's the problem. I mean, if you put him in something Notting Hill standard and he's playing that role, he could do it. He's not quite as everyman as Hugh Grant, but he had a few years on him, and therefore there was probably a gap in the market which other people have come along in stuff like About Time and tried to fill and failed.
Yeah, he ages well. I mean, and he's a great Dr. Watson. I mean, I think
he was always balding slightly, wasn't he?
Yeah.
So he doesn't really look any older now.
Yeah, but he's there's no question that he's one of those. I talked earlier about the idea, can he be a movie star and an actor? Well, he's both. He's a good actor. He's a good character actor.
Could be. There's absolutely no reason.
Yeah. But no, I think for me, ultimately, the problem with the Legend of the Sword thing is that it's trying to set up a franchise. It's yet another thing that's trying to do the Marvel shared universe. Oh, we're going to and it ends with, ironically, a little bit like Justice League, with this setting up of a round table. But the thing is, if you spent an entire movie establishing your King Arthur as a guy who's not this noble, worthy, over-earnest character who's a bit back-in-art and stuff, he's not going to be setting up a court with knights and round tables and going after Grail quests.
That's the problem. You've cast somebody for the quest and not the position at the end of it.
Yeah.
You know, that's the problem. And it's not that bad. I mean, I watched it right after. I mean, the reason we're a bit sketchy on detail, if I'm honest, is we were going to record this a very long time ago, the Arthur show.
Yes.
And stuff happened, mainly with me, I'm to blame. But we didn't end up recording it, and then just not the sort of films you want to re-watch. So we're largely going off memory. I watched Excalibur very recently, so that's not so bad. But I watched this a long time ago, and I don't want to re-watch it. But having said that, I watched it right after the 2004 King Arthur, and it's far, far more entertaining than that. There's no doubt. It's not to say it's better necessarily, but if I'm going to watch two films that largely disinterest me, the one that holds my gaze is going to win. And this held my gaze kind of all right. I don't think Guy Ritchie has ever made a film I've seen, because I haven't seen Swept Away and stuff like that. But I don't think I've ever seen a Guy Ritchie film where I've been outright bored. I just don't overly love his aesthetic. I don't always love his casting. And I think he's trying to affect this Cockney bollocks in all of his films. There's nothing wrong with having Cockney in your films. But, you know, I'm only surprised we didn't get fucking broad Cockney in The Man from U.N.C.L.E. Because he seems to fucking crowbar it in stuff where it's not wanted and not needed. His action sequence have this weird slow motion shit going on as well. You know, I'm always happy to watch a Guy Ritchie film. He's not a Paul W.S. Anderson. He's not a Michael Bay. He's not a Roland Emmerich, a Stephen Sommers. He's not in that group of directors that I know this is going to be utterly mindless shit and I've got no interest in watching it, because every now and again he does an okay film. So I watched this with some hope, and it's okay. I think of the three we've reviewed so far, half-assed, though those reviews might be, this is the one that I'd say, yeah, see it, have a look at it. I think you might be okay. I think the problem with Excalibur is it's dated horrendously. It looks like an early 80s music video, and it's how much you can deal with that aesthetic. Now, this will age just as badly, because it is so of its era Guy Ritchie style, but at the moment, we've not got to the point where it's aged particularly. And
it's only a year old.
And I think, it's watchable enough. It is watchable enough. It's just started very promisingly with a very good cast, and I think he might crack this. You know, I think this might be pretty decent. And at the end of the day, it really wasn't. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work. It's the wrong casting. And again, a bit like with the last two films, for a story that's so well documented in terms of all the beats of what this legend is, in all three of these films, I don't know what the film's trying to tell me. I don't know what the film's there for. I don't know what its through line is. I don't know where. At the end of the day, it's a bit like The Man from U.N.C.L.E. in that it ends up as an origin story with them, you know, fitting their IKEA table together at the end. You know, and I think, well, that's lovely, but it took significantly less than its budget on all formats, and by the time you sell it to streaming services and the few Blu-rays that do get sold, it'll probably just about break even, I'd have thought. But it lost money on its theatrical release, so there's never going to be a sequel to this. And in that respect, it's a bit like The Amazing Spider-Man 2, where you spend most of the film setting up a load of other shit that's never going to happen. Concentrate on the film you're in, you know?
Yeah.
And I do think this felt like it was trying to set up a universe again. This was trying to set up a universe again. This had Iron Man 2 syndrome. Yeah, it was trying to do Iron Man 2 syndrome.
Which is also what killed the Tom Cruise Mummy. This announcement of, look, we've got a shared universe, before you've even seen the first movie.
Well, let's see if it's popular. You know, I don't even mind if you're brave enough in interviews to say, we're looking at that, but let's see how it goes.
Yeah.
But they've pre-announced all this stuff, and the first film out of the gate had a deeply expensive leading man in Tom Cruise in the case of The Mummy, and it didn't do anything enough to justify it. People don't just want shared universes for shared universes' sake. And you only want shared universes because there's a guaranteed stream of income, and there's nothing wrong with that. But we have absolutely no idea whether there's an appetite for all of them. Now, I don't know that Arthur was going to be a shared universe particularly. Maybe it would have, I don't know. But certainly you can tell that this film is racing with like a franchise in mind. And it's too early for that. I mean, Game of Thrones is not popular because it's medieval-ish in style. I say medieval-ish because we don't even know where and what era that's really meant to be. But it's not because of that. And we had this with Gladiator. Gladiator was a massive hit, and so Kingdom of Heaven comes along from the same director within the next 4 or 5 years, and King Arthur and other things. And it's like, well, sometimes maybe it's not the subject matter that's the big draw, it's been the execution. Is Marvel successful because it's a shared universe? I don't know. Maybe it is.
No, sure.
If I knew how to do it, if I knew what was the deal was, I'd be advising these companies and making loads of money myself. So I don't know, but I felt this was premature.
A lot of people felt that the reason the Guy Ritchie Arthur film didn't do so well was that a lot of people were thinking, well, I'm getting this on streaming services or on HBO anyway. I'm getting my dragons with tits or whatever with my Game of Thrones. And in addition to that, if there is a market for a new King Arthur take, it is to go to House of Cards. It's to show the politics of it. You know, maybe an updated sort of King Arthur in the modern world. You know,
no one's got a new take. They just take the basic tenets of it and go, let's do that.
Yeah. And as I say, Star Wars makes it redundant anyway, because Star Wars is King Arthur. I keep saying this, you know. It's a kind of empirical, legitimate narrative fact. But Guy Ritchie's next will be Aladdin. He's doing a live-action Aladdin. I suspect that will make a gazillion quid and redeem whatever setback he had for this. I also do hope, unlike you, that he does give us Sherlock Holmes 3, and I'd like to see Downey and he reunited on that.
I'd like to see Sherlock Holmes 3. I would like him to be a producer on it. I think I would like to see a different voice. I don't mind them using that intellectual property, as in, it's Sherlock Holmes, it's those sets, it's those actors, it's that continuity. I don't actually mind any of that. But I didn't really like Game of Shadows very much. Now, I've only seen it once. I never saw it again. And when we reviewed it recently, if you remember, that was the one I didn't see. I saw the 2009 version. So I don't want to talk with too much.
One of my favourite films.
I don't want to be too declarative about it, because I do think you got to see a film a couple of times to start talking with any.
Well, we can do it again. I mean, I would say it's a shot in the dark meets Rush with love. That's why I love it. I mean, maybe I just have sentimental attachment to it or something.
Shot in the dark, eh? More on that later.
Yeah, a bit of that. Anyway, so that leads us into Monty Python and the Holy Grail. How did you feel about that?
I was relieved. I'd not seen this for about 15 years, but I remember having it recorded off the TV years ago, sort of in my teens. And I wouldn't say I watched it to death, but I watched it plenty. So I knew this film really well at one time. The Pythons are an odd one for me because whilst I acknowledge all of their influence and talent, I prefer some of the things around them. Like, they're a bit smug. And if I want smug upper class comedy of that era, I think I prefer Peter Cook. If I want this kind of slightly batshit off the wall sort of comedic style, and they owe so much to this man, I think I prefer Spike Milligan and his Q series. I think there were sketches in that were very, very Monty Python, and I prefer them. But Holy Grail is probably the best film they ever did. And also, if you take the best of their sketches, so if you go and see like a Live at the Hollywood Bowl type show, where it's just their best stuff for 2 hours, with the exception of still believing the parrot sketch to be the most overrated comedy moment in history, it's really, really good. The best of their stuff is brilliant, but if you just watch episode after episode of Monty Python's Flying Circus, 60% of it's Drek. It really is. But that's not to play them down. This is, I think, their best film. Now, they courted more controversy with the Life of Brian, but this was better. This was funnier. This interested me more, and I laughed out loud several times. I'm trying to think what at now. I laughed at So not appearing in this movie, which is a joke we've cracked on. Do you expect us to talk a few times? I've laughed at Sir Robin the Not As Brave as Galahad and the song around him. I laughed at Runaway. I laughed at them throwing the cows at people. I laughed at the Trojan rabbit. I laughed at the killer rabbit. And I also laughed at the brass neck of going this far into the film, get right to the end, not really knowing how to end it, so having modern day police turn up and just go, that's enough of that, lads. So I had a really, really good time with it. I also like the fact that the films, they chose to make Graham Chapman the lead on their two better known films, because Graham Chapman's an odd one. He's not as showy as some of the other Pythons. I mean, he's not showier than, say, Palin, but he's not as showy as some of them. Funnily enough, he was quite a drunk in real life, and he died relatively young. But he's an interesting presence just as a lead, and I'm not explaining that very well. Do you get what I mean?
No, I get it. Yeah, he's got a quality to him. You watch him well.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it, and the other thing is it's 92 minutes, and I don't mind long films, but certain genres are not suited to long formats, and I genuinely think comedy is best at 90 minutes ish. I've seen all these Judd Apatow films over the years that have significantly good moments to them, but they're too long. The first Anchorman film is, an hour and a half or so. The second one's like 2 hours, and it's all the worse for it. So it's lean, it moves around quite quickly, and it mastered something that we never really saw again until possibly The League of Gentlemen, in that it's at once a narrative and a series of skits. And that's difficult to do, to put effectively a sketch show into a sitcom format, which is what The League of Gentlemen did. And they've done it here, like 25 years before that. So I had a really, really good time with it. I mean, again, the brass neck you follow the story, and the story ends with, that's enough of that, guys. And the police just turn up to stop them.
Yeah, and we take that sort of random surrealism for granted nowadays, and we also take historical comedy for granted. Obviously, subsequently we've got Blackadder, and as you pointed out, Horrible Histories has. Well,
Horrible Histories I've never seen, but about 2 years ago, they made Bill. 2.5 years ago, something like that. They made Bill, which is Monty Python for a very, very slightly younger audience. And when I mean that, I mean ostensibly it might be aimed at kids, but there were some sex jokes in it and stuff. And there were jokes in it that would go over kids' heads, like, have you had your 2 a week? And it's their joke on, like, how much fruit they could get back then. Have you had your 5 a day? I certainly think I would love to see more of them, because they are the modern Pythons, and I've seen no evidence as to whether they're going to do anything like that again. But yeah, for pure surrealism, I think I prefer Spike Milligan. Mm-hmm. And I think, if I want to watch smug posh boys do comedy, I think I prefer Beyond the Fringe.
It's interesting you mentioned Posh, because this is a story that's a little bit murky, and I don't want to misrepresent it, and he's a very diplomatic guy anyway.
I've got nothing wrong with posh boys. There's nothing wrong with posh people, by the way. It just, the problem is... Sorry, just to finish that point. The problem, there's nothing wrong with being posh. You are what you are, and you're born how you're born. But the problem is, when it's a bit like watching a group of MPs together all riling each other up, and you think, when you come from a background where the perception of the majority of the public is, rightly or wrongly, that you've had it fairly easy, you end up coming off as smug. And I think the Pythons have a tendency to come off as a bit fucking smug. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and there's also that tendency for people to quote them like that, like by knowing Monty Python, you're somehow some higher form of intellectual life.
And it's not that intellectual. Most of it's a load of pissing around, and I think that kind of gets forgotten with all of this stuff. That we think there's something intellectually rigorous about the Pythons. There isn't. It's a lot of messing around.
But it is interesting you mentioned class, because I said it was talk, and I don't know how the story quite pans out, and I haven't misrepresented it. But David Jason did some work with them at some point, and I think there was a window in which they could have included him more in the development of a sketch or something. It's a quite obscure story, but you just get a vibe from it that he wasn't part of the club or something. And that's not to say that the Pythons were classist or that Jason wasn't brought in because he was, not from that stable. But you can't read that through without thinking, But on the other hand, he had a perfectly good career without them, and likewise. And he's also a jobbing actor. These guys are comedic writers who happened to do acting. Cleese, of course, is as much a writer as he is an actor. And Connie Booth, who wrote Fawlty Townsend, turns up in the Holy Grail, doesn't she? Beautiful. Lovely.
She's there as a witch. Yes,
and she's now she's now a different kind of witch. She's now a white psychiatrist, something like that.
That's a very different kind of witch.
Yes. Good, a benign witch. Miss Booth, if you're available anytime you want to, therapize, therapeutic, have me for a session. I'm totally up for analysis. Just putting it out there. You will have to dress in your Fawlty Towers costume. Sorry, I'm going off on where was I? So, Holy Grail. The reason I like it overall is it is ironically, despite being just a comedy and a spoof, a really good version of the Arthur myth. Insofar as they do actually tick the boxes of certain Arthur stories. I think the comedic legacy can be seen as well, because the cloppity clop thing with the coconut thing, that's been copied again and again. It was used very well in Ken Branagh's Much Ado About Nothing, which I do recommend as well as Mung Branagh's Best before Branagh. Anyway, that's a different podcast altogether. Also in a post-Brexit world, the folly de grandeur of the Brits going off and doing something on their own, in that bit where Arthur and his knights go to the French castle asking, do you want to join us on our quest for the Holy Grail? No, we've already got one. And you just think, could there be a better metaphor for where we are politically? So, it's a recommend. It's on Netflix. It's a fun, easy watch. And that leads us neatly into The Last Crusade, Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade. Dave, what do you think?
Reviewed this on To Expect Us to Talk a couple of years ago, so my more detailed thoughts are there, but I don't think very often I don't think I can think of many series that have been able to finish on their own terms like this. If I thought hard enough, this is why I don't want more Indiana Jones films. It's not because Indiana Jones, the actor playing him, is nearly 80, although that's part of it, because we haven't had films in between. So it's going to be jarring, because we have an archetype in our heads of what he is, and he's a 40-year-old guy in a fedora. He's not an 80-year-old guy in a fedora. So it's partly that. It's partly the era, because we know him as 30s and 40s, so I don't really want him turning up in the Woodstock era. But if I had to just put one headline on why I don't want any more Indiana Jones films, it's less pressing with the fifth one than it was with the fourth, because at the end of the third they rode off into the sunset. And film series are normally either come to a natural end, or they don't do well enough to warrant sequels, or they start garnering sequels and the sequels don't do as well as they want, or they run out of steam. And so you normally get some half-assed bow put on things. This was a filmmaker at the peak of his powers, 3 or 4 years before Schindler and all the rest of it, and at the end of a decade where he'd made E.T. and Raiders and God knows what else. This was a filmmaker at the film.
Transitional film for all of them, I think.
And the problem is, by the time you come back, if you have them come back, and in this film you had a 69-year-old actor, well, if you come back nearly 20 years later, or the 59-year-old actor, I'm sorry, if you come back 20 odd years later, you've got to explain what's happened to that actor if he doesn't want to.
That's Sean Connery, yeah?
Yeah, so Sean Connery, then they've got to kill off the character. Well, they didn't have to, but that strikes me as a very George Lucas move, that you've got to explain everything. So instead of just saying, so not appearing in this movie, you've got to say he's died or whatever. That's very George Lucas, but you've got that. You've then got to try and move the characters on a little bit, so you're then into the realms of having a child come into it. But it also then, because it's so many years on, it starts taking on a greatest hits air of what did people like in those original three. Well, they loved Marion more than any of the other women as a character, so you bring her back, but the actress in question hasn't acted much in the interim, so she just ends up grinning and looking pleased to be there, as opposed to giving any kind of performance. But the problem you've got is this isn't as good as Raiders, and I had to think about this very hard when I reviewed them, because this is my favourite of the three. Well, if you're saying this is my favourite, but it's not the best, are you saying it's not the best because you believe it's not the best, or are you just
giving into public opinion and saying, okay, well, it's not the best. Well, I really had to think about that. What Raiders has is a consistency, so from frame one, and almost every scene advances plot or character. It's Back to the Future level perfect that way. This film doesn't have that. I watched it for my review a couple of years ago, sorry. And I watched it twice. First time, no problem, watched it through. Second time, I was really tired, and I went to watch it, and I fell asleep, like literally within the first 4 or 5 minutes. I don't think we'd even finished with River Phoenix. And I fell asleep, and I woke up about 2 or 3 minutes before I knew Connery was going to appear, and I didn't rewind it, and that says everything you need to know about this film. What it is a fantastic film from about 48 minutes till the moment it closes, and before that it's nothing special, but it's got that ride off into the sunset, and it's a metaphor for finishing on your terms in every way, because the thing is as well, Sean Connery didn't make much of Worth after this. He made a few films, but he didn't make much that was really terrific, because he'd already made, I think might have made The Hunt for Red October, actually. I've got a feeling that was 1990. But he didn't make anything that amazing. I always thought it was 1987, that's why I got confused. But had he called time on his career here, he wouldn't have gone out on a notorious flop that he hated making, and is still notorious as the film that sent him into retirement and so on. We wouldn't have had to explain Delham Elliott not being there because the character's dead, because the actor's dead. I just think this could have been the perfect textbook example for a film series not only going out on its own terms, but going out at bang on the top of its game. And that's why I resent them continuing to make these.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, the fourth one, if you like, opens a floodgate into it a bit. Because they've got to make up for it. And Spielberg, one of the reasons The Last Crusade is so good is because Spielberg gave everything he could to making it the apology for Temple of Doom, which, perhaps wrongly, was viewed as something that needed apologizing for. I mean, I believe that Temple of Doom is underrated. I believe it's also erroneously thought of as the inverted commas dark one, when in fact Raiders of the Lost Ark is a far, far more frightening and dark movie. It's just that the violence in Temple of Doom is more intense and more self-contained. But as an action film, Temple of Doom, it breezes along and has great pace to it. But Temple of Doom, because it was perceived as dark and less successful, they basically make in Last Crusade a kind of a Raiders retread, to some extent. It's a very good Raiders retread, and it's cerebral, and it's witty, and it's got heart and soul. It's got the most maturity, I think, of the series in terms of...
It also it throws the format, though, because had they made something as different from Temple as Temple was from Raiders as their third film, then Indiana Jones going forward would have been a lot more malleable. But it isn't. It's this 1 in 3 format now.
And that's the problem with Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, is that they play it ultra safe when they didn't have to. So my feeling is that for the fifth, whichever way we look at it, Spielberg is going to pull out all the stops creatively to once again conclude the series in some sense. But I don't think he's going to do what some online people are talking. There are two options that people keep talking about as foregone conclusions, and I wish they'd stop doing this. Every pundit who gets thousands of bloody hits on their YouTube doing, this is how you need to do Indiana Jones 5. 1, it's got to be really dark like Logan, and you've got to kill Mary, and you've got to kill Shia LaBeouf, and it's got to be his final thing.
It needs to be absolutely nothing like Logan.
Yeah. And the second one they keep going with this shit is, we need to reboot, or we need like halfway through, he's gonna flashback, or he's gonna pass the man.
You don't reboot in universe like that, you don't.
Yeah.
They tried that with Star Trek in 2009, rebooting it in front of our eyes, and it was so successful there, but no, you don't do that. If you want to reboot Indiana Jones, you wave off Harrison Ford, you say thanks for your service, and 4 or 5 years later, somebody else comes along in an unrelated adventure.
Exactly, precisely. And I think maybe that's the plan anyway. But what I want is a self-contained thriller. Because the problem with Crystal Skull is that it doesn't thrill. I do want them to go back to... I don't want them to go full-on voodoo or kind of, occultish again. But I do want that kind of hint of horror, certainly that Raiders and Temple have. And I think even Last Crusade, with the exception of the end sequence with the guy aging before Alison Judy's face, in Walter Donovan disappears into waves. That's the only kind of gruesome bit. I think they do need to revisit that kind of creepy, crawly, dark shadows, shards of blue light through the, apparitions in the floor, sort of atmospheric. There was talk of a haunted house MacGuffin being part of Last Crusade. I think they could easily resurrect that and have it is all being shot in London, I know that, so maybe this fifth one they're going to go
We don't know if that means very location specific or whether that means an awful lot of soundstage work with green screen though too. We just don't know yet.
You're of the view that even though he is pushing 80, he needs to do action. He needs to be punching people and shooting and stuff like that.
Yeah, because that wasn't the problem. In Crystal Skull, where he was like mid to late 60s, the one punch-up we had with that guy who was eventually eaten by the ants was terrific. He's good at that, and he won't lose that. He'll still be able to do punch-ups. Because the thing is, he wasn't that effective a fighter anyway. He was always like up against it as a character in these fights anyway. So
that's the appeal of it. He was always old and grumpy.
I genuinely don't mind an 80-year-old having a go at that.
Yeah, and I think it would be interesting. I think it also forces people to confront old age in a constructive rather than a destructive way. Because I think one of the mistakes that a lot of franchises and series and books makes is this idea of
but if you can turn that, why are you doing it with an archetype? Why are you doing it where we've got a frozen image of what that guy looks like? That and
maybe it's a challenge.
You don't really age, not that way. Now the film's coming, and I'll watch it with an open mind. I'm not against it totally, but I do see problems with this. And frankly, they had not a perfect trilogy, because I'm not fond of Temple of Doom, but they finished their trilogy in a perfect place, and that makes life difficult.
Yeah, I'm keeping an open mind too, but I would say this. Last Crusade, of course, deals with the Arthurian template, and as I say, the implication being that Indiana Jones is sort of a Lancelot or a Galahad, with his dad played by Sean Connery, and the two of them, that the Grail quest is the quest for father, and so on. And they then kind of try and repeat that for King of the Crystal Skull. It doesn't quite work because the chemistry's not in place and the other pieces aren't in place. But I do think that one of the things I mentioned about King Arthur from the beginning, Dave, is this idea that with King Arthur, you take him from birth to death, and his death is a constructive thing. Now, I'm not saying that I want to see Indiana Jones killed off, I certainly don't. We've established we don't want this dark and broody, let's talk about death and aging movie, but I do think that there is something...
I don't mind that, but I don't I want it because it's right for the story you want to tell. I don't want it because the studio saw Logan make a load of money.
Yeah,
that's the sort of thing.
Isn't there were rumours that before Danny Boyle got involved in Bond 25...
Yeah, that's exactly what I was about to say. This is the sort of bandwagon jumping Eon have been doing for years, and Exhibit B, because Exhibit A is the time they waste between the entries, but Exhibit A has been, Eon in the last few years do nothing but fucking copy everything. You go back to Casino Royale, which is one of the best films they've made in the entire series. That whole parkour sequence exists because... it was on all the BBC idents around that time. Quantum of Solace went all shaky cam because of that. The next film went about lost data because civil servants were leaving things on trains in the end of the last decade. I'm just sick of going, let's jump on that bandwagon. At least with Eon, they're taking things sort of from real world. But there were rumours that they wanted to do a Logan-inspired thing for Bond, and you think, well, that's like trying to copy Deadpool because that made a load of money. Well,
I'd rather see a Deadpool Bond movie.
Yeah, but I don't want Bond constantly breaking the fourth wall and doing really, really lewd humour because it's not right for him.
Yeah,
and I just think the same is true here. If you genuinely, i.e., sometime between Crystal Skull and now, you thought, well, if we ever do another one, I would really like an end of life tale almost, where he's
but in a constructive way, in a positive way.
I don't have any strong feelings on what it would need to be. What I'm trying to say is, if you wanted the Logan's type story, then I'd have been happier if that was 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, and you've been sat going, if we ever do another one, let's make it a sort of end of life, battling, the end of your vitality kind of story, rather than having no idea what you want to do, watching Logan make a load of money and saying, let's do that. It pisses me off.
Yeah,
because
that is the nature of film, though. That is the nature.
Yeah, but it is. But most of these people, I would accept, have more talent than me. They're there and they're making successful decisions and they're doing the right things. And certainly in the case of companies like Eon, they've stayed in the business a long time. I don't totally want to slate them, But at the same time, when they're doing things that I think that takes no talent or idea or originality whatsoever, then I do think you don't have the talent for this. Get out of the game. But let's see what Danny Boyle has to offer. At least they had the good sense. Now, Danny Boyle's offer and film might be terrible. We don't know. But there is at least a kind of sense in going, let's see what an experienced, seasoned, versatile filmmaker can do with this. At least they've had the sense to do that. I mean, the biggest thing with Eon is they keep hiring the same writers. And you think, well, year after year, they're sticking out films that aren't that amazing.
Yeah.
You know, isn't it time to try something else? They've got this weird inferiority complex about their franchise that they think, well, we're lucky to have them. You are the Bond franchise. You can have any fucking writers you want.
Well, the other rumour was that they were going to go the Kingsman route. And Kingsman, of course, as another, King Arthur kind of overlap, has all the, heraldic and sort of, it has the fantastical side, but it trades on that Englishness, or that kind of Guy Ritchie, Matthew Vaughn vision of Englishness that is the kind of the nouveau riche boarding school pub, but still trading off stuff like Savile Row and whatnot, which is kind of where Bond, to some extent, comes from. To some extent, there's an element of that. But yeah, back to Indiana Jones. I mean, I do think that The Last Crusade, ironically enough, despite not being a King Arthur film, is the best King Arthur movie out of the ones that we've selected. Because you have all the Arthurian dimensions. You have a biblical MacGuffin in the Grail itself. You have a sense of closure, as you pointed out. Not necessarily aging and death per se, but certainly a sense of progression that was otherwise missing from what was intended to be a kind of a serial franchise. There were little moments where Indy is sort of looking to the camera or looking at his desk or whatever it is, where you're getting that sense of progress in the character and looking back as well. Also, we talked about good Arthur lore starts with the childhood. Well, we get the prequel here. A fantastic performance from River Phoenix as a young Harrison Ford, but also a young Indy. It's not an impression, and yet it captures the essence of him. And I think it's a shame that he died. I think, what was it, you think he may have had a career a bit like Leonardo DiCaprio's or something like that. He'd be about 48.
Yeah, he's a little bit older than Leo, but yeah, basically, when I look at him, I'm looking at a similar quality.
Yeah.
And, and if families are any guide, you look at the career Joaquin Phoenix has had, his brother. So I do think he certainly wouldn't have gone through his life doing pretty boy stuff. I'm not even sure whether he would have been interested in like a Titanic or something, but I think he could have had an interesting varied career. I wasn't attached enough to the actor to think, oh my god, what a loss, in that, yes, it was a loss, but there aren't many like signature performances from this guy where I go, oh, I wish I'd seen more than that, because I struggle to think of his films half of the time. But he was very good.
It's a wonderful take on the pre-credit coda to the indie lore, and I think what's interesting about it, a number of things, is that could have run as a formula. It's a torch passing it isn't, because it's still Harrison's movie, but it just leaves the idea that if Harrison gets bored of this or gets too old in a couple of years, we can maybe pass on to this guy. And I think the other thing is nowadays, I mean, we talked about the Guy Ritchie King Arthur earlier on, and it's the overextension of this. We're starting this big epic mythology. We're going to have 17 movies, by the end of which it says, you are Arthur. It was one of the problems I thought with the BBC Merlin a couple of years ago, because they kept, the first season was promising, but they kept going on with this. We're building to this. Well, Spielberg manages.
That's what kills heroes in the end.
Spielberg manages, albeit in a very contrived, very kind of neat and tidy way, to give us where Indy got his entire motifs. The hat, the scar, the whip, the sense of adventure, the losing and yet winning at the same time. And the way they just fade into his smile as he's getting punched on the boat, winning but losing at the same time, just summing up the character. That he's not a loser, he is the winner, but he's very human and very likeable. Very much a Lancelot, as I say. He's not a King Arthur, he's not a Merlin, but he is very much in that Arthurian lore of the heraldic knight who's romantic and is on the side of good, but is maybe occasionally a very naughty boy who's very flawed and so on. And if they can capture that essence, maybe even part sequel, part prequel, without not quite as vulgar as an in-universe reboot, they can do a little bit of that kind of Godfather 2 quality. Because you're about to do Godfather, do you expect us to talk? And the interesting thing is, Dave, that Godfather 2, of course, merges sequel and prequel. And there was talk for a while that it was going to be Godfather 4, and they were going to go back to that well. and they were going to
I
have...
think we were going to go to Sonny's Youth or something like that.
Yeah, but they were still going to have an elderly Michael, because obviously we see Michael's death here in part 3, but it's left kind of open that it's many, many years afterwards. And see Andy Garcia's Don presiding over the end of the Corleones. So we're going to show the Corleones at their peak and at their end, and something kind of in between. If they can manage that for a fifth Indiana Jones time upgrade, because they certainly manage it for the third. It's the best Arthur movie out of the Arthur movies we've looked at without it being an Arthur movie. To the extent that I wonder what a Spielberg King Arthur would have looked like. But that's the end of Arthur, I think. Have you got anything else you want to add or say?
No, I know that whatever we do next I'll probably enjoy more.
Okay, but we are thinking about Mother Russia, aren't we? Maybe?
We are, yes.
The reason for that, guys, is in case you hadn't been reading the press recently, there's a little bit of trouble with Russia at the moment. And Hollywood foresaw this, we believe, about 20 years ago, when we were post-Cold War. They tried using Arab terrorists, IRA, Colombian drug lords and so on as the baddies, but then they decided, no, let's just go back to Russia. So we're going to look at, through the filter of our current semi-new Cold War, some of the Hollywood movies that sort of tried to go to Russia without just restarting the Cold War and doing this as a period piece. And I think it's going to be interesting. They're not necessarily all quality movies, but they're all fun, and I hope you enjoyed watching, Dave, and I look forward to talking about them. In the meantime, Dave, where can we find you?
You can find me at the Pasty Kid 1976 on Twitter. You can find You Expect Us to Talk at Expect Us to Talk on Twitter, facebook.com/Expect Us to Talk, or just search Do Expect Us to Talk on Twitter. On iTunes, on Stitcher, or on YouTube. I also appear on Smorgasbord. That's board spelt B-O-R-E-D. So that's at Smorgasbord Pod. I appear on that show in a spin-off named Three Wise Men, which is just basically a load of idiotic opinion. Quelle surprise.
Nothing idiotic about today. You're a very, very intellectual, erudite correspondent with the occasional fart gag thrown in. And Do You Expect Us to Talk has just finished Tarantino, and you're about to start The Godfather, as I mentioned, yeah?
Absolutely.
Via a quick GoldenEye commentary.
GoldenEye commentary records in the next couple of days. Was going to be today, actually, but we've got caught up in other things.
You need to combine it with a drinking game. Every time Pierce says yes, there's a one-line yes. Just pick up a drink. All right, well, Dave, it's been emotional. Listeners, thank you very much. I hope you're having a great bank holiday. Enjoy Avengers, etc., The Sun, and think of the once and future promise of Britain and King Arthur, and feel free to check out any of these movies. So until the next time, goodbye, God bless, and thanks for listening.